thank you for joining us for the 2025 Municipal Leaders Roles and Responsibilities Seminar. My name is Adam Brome, and I am a Strategic Communications Advisor with SARM. A few items to note before we get started are that the session will be recorded and copies of both the recording and presentations will be distributed by email to all attendees following the webinar. If you're attending as a group, please ensure all attendees are registered individually so that they receive credit for the session. You can also send Christina Berry, who is on our call today, our MLDP administrator, an email with attendee names following the webinar. We will begin today's webinar with a few words from the SARM President and RMAA Vice President, followed by our main presentations and Q&A sessions where attendees can ask any questions regarding the subject matter that was presented. Please submit your questions through the chat and our presenters will respond during the dedicated Q&A periods. If we do run out of time before your questions have been asked, we will provide those responses to you offline after the webinar. And please note that questions are visible by all participants and presenters. So if there's anything you would like to ask offline, please forward those questions to our presenters or SARM staff members following today's seminar. And if you do experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please let us know through the chat and we will do our best to troubleshoot. If you experience any issues with your audio or video, please first try logging out of the session and then rejoining. This tends to help reset your device settings. I'll now hand it over to Dustin Resch, SARM's Director of Capacity Building and Programs, who will be moderating today's session.
Hey, thanks, Adam. Again, want to welcome everybody here. Really excited that you took time out of your schedule and out of your day to learn about important matters for the work of running a municipality. So whether you're an elected official or an administrator, we hope that what we have ahead of us here will be really beneficial to you. We're going to start off, as was mentioned, with remarks from the SARM President, Bill Huber, and then we'll move to remarks also from the Rural Municipal Administrators Association. Michelle Buechler will be speaking to us there. And then I have what I've been considering and calling the governance dream team ahead of us. We've got folks from the Ministry of Government Relations, the Ombudsman's office, and a governance consultant as well. So we've got three very important and helpful and different perspectives to look at this matter of roles and responsibilities in municipalities. So without further ado, we'll hear from President Bill Huber, and we'll move immediately to the RMAA presentation from Michelle Buechler.
Welcome everyone to the Municipal Leaders Roles and Responsibilities Workshop, a module of the Municipal Leadership Development Program. I am Bill Huber, President of SARM. On behalf of SARM, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for choosing a role in local government. You have all made an important decision to serve your municipality and take an active role in guiding its future. Local government plays an important role in our daily lives. Not only the lives of the ones holding a seat at the table, but the lives of the public as well. An educated local government is a strong local government. So thank you for being here today to learn about the roles and the responsibilities of being a municipal leader. This fall marked the 22nd anniversary of the MLDP. The first modules rolled out in October of 2003, and since that time there have been several hundred MLD workshops with several thousand municipal leaders attending one or more modules. Throughout that time, SARM has served as the administrator of the MLDP. Today's workshop is just one of 6 currently offered. On the MLDP website, you will be able to review all the modules available through the program. MLDP modules are offered in various formats, including in-person, online, and virtual. I encourage you to take the modules. They will benefit you as a member of local government. Christina Berry, the program administrator, is on the webinar this afternoon. Please contact her by email or telephone if you have any questions or would like to discuss this program with her. Her email address and telephone number will be listed in the chat. In recognition of your attendance at this workshop, each of you will receive a certificate of completion and credit in the program. The certificates will be emailed directly to you. As you may have already heard, this will be the last year SARM is serving as administrator of the MLDP program. Our organization's intention is to use what we learned through the MLDP and apply it to new programming currently under construction. We look forward to sharing more about our municipal education programming in the coming months. One thing is certain, strengthening municipal leaders strengthens municipalities, and that makes a difference across the whole province. What you learn today or in SARM's other education programming will make your community stronger. Today's session will conclude at 4:30. I hope you find it worthwhile and the information useful. I want to thank our presenters and everyone for joining us today. Our next speaker is Michelle Beekler, the Vice President of the Rural Municipal Administrators Association. Michelle is also the Administrator of the RM of Peyton, number 470.
Hello, I am Michelle Beekler. I am the Vice President of the Rural Municipal Administrators Association of Saskatchewan. Congratulations on taking the initiative to engage in the Municipal Leadership Development modules. By participating in the MLDP classes, municipal leaders will gain knowledge of their roles and responsibilities, financial planning, economic development, human resources, communications, and land use planning. You will become better equipped to make informed decisions navigating complex regulatory frameworks and serve your communities more effectively. Training and continued training are so valuable. John F. Kennedy said, "Leadership and learning are indispensable to each other." Educational training plays a critical role in both personal development and societal progress. It equips the individuals with the knowledge, skills, and mindsets required to navigate the municipal world. SARM has implemented a new training program called SEEDS. SEEDS is an online learning forum for busy counselors. The SEEDS program is a powerful example of how educational training can contribute to your role as municipal officials. Whether you're in your first term or are a seasoned counselor, SEEDS offers you the tools and tips that are important to your role as a member of council. The modules are only 10 minutes and you can do them at your own pace. If you're passionate about learning and looking for a way to grow personally and professionally, check out the SEEDS program on the SARM website. Thank you for investing in your growth. Every class you take shows your commitment of learning and improving your position. Your effort makes a world of difference. Thank you.
All right. So after the preliminary marks have been shared, as they have been, we're able to move into our series of 3 presentations. Our first presentation is called Building the Foundation, What You Need to Know About the Municipalities Act. Our presenter is Megan Istace, who started her municipal career in 2010 as the first intern under SARM's Municipal Administrator Internship Program, the MAPE program. After several years as the administrator of a rural municipality southeast of Regina, she joined the Ministry of Government Relations in 2019, and in September 2023, transitioned into the role of manager of the advisory services team. When she's not working, Megan enjoys spending time with her family and, most importantly, her rescue dog, Boggs. So Megan and I have had the opportunity to work on a number of things over the past handful of years. And it's an absolute delight, of course, to have her with us today to share her presentation, again entitled Building the Foundation, What You Need to Know About the Municipalities Act.
Well, thank you, Dustin, and I was going to say good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I appreciate the invitation to come and speak with each of you. I'm assuming many are just recently elected, maybe in a by-election, but I also hope that there are some that are attending today's course as a refresher or to show leadership within the council that you serve to those new members that have joined. So I have, I believe, about an hour scheduled, but about 35 minutes of material, depends how fast I talk. I encourage you to please use the chat feature to ask any questions, and Dustin can interrupt me when you see fit, and I'll try and take a pause where appropriate. So without further ado, I just want to make sure everybody can see what I'm seeing, and I think we're good to go. So we're going to talk about roles and responsibilities according to the Municipalities Act. And things that we're going to cover today are the basic fundamentals, talk about accountability, the specifics about roles as they're laid out in the Act. I'm going to touch on council meetings because that is an important subject matter, and then highlight some of the additional resources. By no means is this the be-all end-all of what you need to know about what's in the Municipalities Act, but I hope that it will give you a good foundation, building that foundation of how you're going to continue in your role as an elected official. So without further ado, let's start with the fundamentals. So the Municipalities Act is the legislation that provides the framework under which municipalities govern. Cities have the Cities Act, and then those in our northern communities are under the Northern Municipalities Act. All are very similar in probably about 90% of what is legislated. But the heart of it is that the Act is not a guide, it's your fundamental rule book. It provides municipalities with the flexibility to respond to their existing and future needs of their residents in creative and innovative ways. And that's language taken right from the Municipalities Act. It also legislates that municipalities are accountable to the people that elect them and are responsible for encouraging and enabling public participation in the governance process. Now, I would encourage you as we move through those slides is think about how does your municipality encourage that public participation and enable it in the way that you do your business. The Municipalities Act also specifically recognizes municipalities as a level of government on matters that are within their jurisdiction, and that they're a creation of the province who are empowered to govern themselves and make decisions that as a municipality that you consider are to be in the best interests of your residents and in compliance with all legislation. The Municipalities Act also provides you with powers, duties, and functions that you need to fulfill your purpose. And we're going to discuss what the municipal purposes are that are set out in the Municipalities Act. So those purposes are provide good government, making decisions that affect everyone in the municipality, not just specific to your division, but the entire municipality. Your purpose is people want service. Let me start that over. People want services and facilities. Part of your job is determining what is needed versus what is wanted, and then figuring out how to resource those services or facilities. People also want communities that are safe, obviously. And of course, you will want a municipality that is viable far beyond your term of office. And ratepayers want their municipality to be part of fostering economic, social, and environmental well-being. And lastly, a municipality has a responsibility to safeguard and maintain its infrastructure and public assets. All of these statements are set out in the Act, and they're very broad, but they're powerful. One could say that when you're faced with making, well, really any decision, but most definitely a difficult decision for your municipality, ask yourself if you're meeting your purpose. I've actually suggested even printing this off and hanging it up in your council chambers as your reminder of what is the purpose of your municipal government. Some basic principles, likewise, municipalities as local governments, they're created and empowered by the province to be a responsible and accountable level of government within your jurisdiction. You're also subject to provincial laws and to certain limits and restrictions that are set out in provincial interest, set out in legislation. So that means you got to follow all the different acts. Well, I just went blank on them, but Local Authority Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. We have the Construction Codes Act, the Planning and Development Act. We would have, the Fire Safety Act. All legislation that's in place, municipalities, of course, are expected to follow and adhere to. Another feature within the Municipalities Act that you may have heard if you've contacted our office and spoke to a municipal advisor is that natural person powers. What natural person powers are is they provide municipalities essentially with the same legal powers as other corporations or persons to conduct their day-to-day business without the need for a specific legislative authority. And again, subject to any limitations in legislation. An example I like to use is that Council has the natural person power to decide that they want to install security cameras on municipal property. That's a natural person power. But because you're a municipal or a municipality is a level of government, you're subject to the Local Authority Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. So although you may decide to install those cameras, you need to ensure that you're adhering to the applicable legislation that would have oversight on how recordings are dealt with and managed, how you would notify people in those public spaces that they are subject to being recorded, just as an example. Natural person powers is something that came into the legislation almost 20 years ago when the Municipalities Act came into play after the Rural Municipalities Act and the Urban Municipalities Act. The concept of a natural person power changed the default authority from prescriptive to being permissive. So it doesn't give you more jurisdiction than what you already had in legislation. It gives you more flexibility of how you maneuver in making your decisions. So some other examples where a municipality has natural person powers, they can acquire and sell property. It's a natural person power to choose if you want to sell land, but the legislation is specific that if it's below market value, that there's legislative limitations that require public notice when you're intending to sell. Other examples is that you can enter contracts. You can choose whom you provide grants to. You can also determine your minimum staffing requirements. Do you require additional office staff? Do you require a dedicated road crew? Or is that something that you wish to contract out to a local contractor? Do you require a registered planner on staff if you have a lot of development going on in your municipality? Those are all natural person powers that you have the power to decide as a municipality. And again, they don't override your legislated duties, such as preparing your budget or appointing an auditor or hiring a qualified administrator, but it gives you the flexibility of how you're going to achieve or carry out those duties. Again, subject to any limitations that are in legislation. And here I'm not going to go through each of the different pieces on the screen, but as you can see, there's a division of powers between municipal, provincial, and federal, and each have their own jurisdiction that is established in law. But at the end of the day, the thing that we always need to keep top of mind is that as a municipality, you are a level of government, just as the provincial government and the federal government are. As elected officials, ratepayers expect that you're going to function that way. And although we may have experience maybe from serving on a local co-op or a credit union board who have their own bylaws and procedures, they don't always translate to being a council member of your municipality. You have significant autonomy to make decisions within your jurisdiction, and to balance that is where we're going to lead into our next topic of accountability. Okay. So when I talk about accountability, we like to focus on 4 key areas that apply to you. You'll see in that wheel, we have the oath of office, we have code of ethics bylaw, the conflict of interest rules, as well as public disclosure statements. So I'm going to cover those a little bit more in depth. And this is usually when the questions start. So let's start with the oath of office or affirmation of office for some. That's the initial foundation of accountability. What is that oath or affirmation? So this is a form that's prescribed in the municipality's regulations that you should have all signed prior to your first meeting after being elected. And prescribed meaning that it's a specific form provided in legislation. Any member of council who refuses to sign this oath has no right to participate in council debate or decisions. And actually, I believe there's some proposed amendments in the bill that's in the Legislative Assembly right now to make it even more clear that that right does not exist until that oath is signed, that you cannot participate. The Act very clearly states that currently every member of council shall, before carrying out any power, duty, or function of his or her office, take an oath or affirmation in the prescribed form. And again, your administrator will have provided you with this form shortly after you're elected. Just make sure it has been signed before your first council meeting commences. And oaths of office, as you see on the slide, they are available for public inspection. Every municipality in the province must also have a code of ethics bylaw in place. So this bylaw defines how you, as a council member, should treat staff, other council members, and the public. It talks about honesty. So council members must be truthful and open. Talks about I'm tripping over my words today, sorry. Objectivity. Decisions must be made carefully, fairly, and impartially. Respect for everyone, including other council members and staff, who must be treated with dignity, understanding, and respect. Transparency and accountability. You see some themes here. Council business should be conducted in open sessions so citizens will clearly see how and why decisions are made. Confidentiality is also a key part of that code of ethics standards. Confidential information that you've learned during the course of performing your office must be kept private. As a member of council, you should not benefit from information you learned in fulfilling your role as an elected official. Leadership and public interest. You're going to serve your citizens and act in the best interests of the municipality. You understand that personal benefit, wrongdoing, or unethical conduct must not be tolerated. And lastly, responsibility. Act in accordance with legislation, disclose all conflicts of interest, and follow the policies and procedures of your municipality. The legislation requires that the bylaw includes a process for dealing with contraventions to the Code of Ethics. And it should also include potential remedial actions that are required of a council member that's violated the Code of Ethics. Some possibilities of remedial action might be an apology to whomever filed the complaint under your bylaw. It could also be direction to take training. The Act does not specify the different types of remedial action. That's determined by your by your Code of Ethics bylaw. Next topic that I wanted to cover is the public disclosure statements. So public disclosure statement has a direct impact when you're dealing with a conflict of interest. And it is also a public document that can be inspected by anyone. This form is not a prescribed form in legislation, but it's prescribed of what it needs to include. Your municipality will have its own form for its use. It is something that we're just currently reviewing to determine if there's an update for the sample that we require. That is something that our branch actually has a sample of available on the website that I'll get to at the end of the presentation. But you would have required to complete this when you submitted your nomination papers. And then again, once you were elected to have completed that within 30 days. Now, it contains certain information about your or your family's employment, financial interests, business interests, and public holdings, or property holdings. And when I say family, that is your spouse and your dependents only. So one statement in the oath of office is that you will declare any conflict of interest. This is where the public disclosure statement comes into play. A public disclosure statement contains information, like I said, that not only applies to yourself as a council member, but to your spouse and dependents as defined as family in the Act. So your employers, where your financial interests are. You're not putting dollar amounts, but you're disclosing the relationships, those financial interests. If you're a shareholder or a, I can't think of the name, but in a partnership, you would identify those business holdings and those business interests and your property holdings. So where you own property, the land descriptions of those. Your public disclosure statement follows your term of office in its entirety. So you would have completed it when you were elected. And then each year, you would require to declare, make an annual declaration by November 30th. So if you haven't done that already, we're a few days late, but make sure you get that done and into your administrator. And if you have any changes that you need to report, to update that and notify your administrator within 30 days of any change. So something to think about is maybe you bought a new parcel of land, or you have changed your employer, or you're no longer in a business relationship and or in a partnership, and you need to remove that from your declaration. Just make sure that you're updating your forms. And then in addition to completing a public disclosure statement, I've already gone through that. It's doing that annual declaration. Sorry, I copied my notes twice. So yes, make sure it's updated within 30 days. When you've had a change, notify your administrator when you have that change, and it will be put on the file for public inspection. Public disclosure statements is one of the components that are monitored for an annual declaration, in addition to having, I believe, your oath of offices, the annual audited financial statements, waterworks reporting if applicable, in order to receive your MRS grants. I won't go into too much detail with that, as that's not necessarily my wheelhouse, but they're an integral part of making sure that you have them and that you're updating them appropriately so that your municipality continues to receive grants available. And then conflict of interest as a whole, it's an essential part of legislation that all members of council need to be mindful of. It's okay to have a conflict of interest. In fact, it's probably a high possibility that many of council members will eventually have one or more that comes before the council table. And it's likely to occur more in smaller communities where the pool of potential contractors or employees is smaller to draw from. What's really important, though, is how you handle a conflict of interest. The onus is on the individual member to make the declaration or declare when they're in conflict of interest. Nobody else can declare it on your behalf. This is an ethical duty essential to good governance. It's not a responsibility, like I said, for other members to monitor or police the handling of your conflict of interest, nor is it the responsibility of municipal staff. Every council member, when you sign your oath of office, actually swears or affirms that a conflict of interest is going to be disclosed. Now, conflicts of interest, they're not to be made a secret or kept as or observed as a secret. There's ways that you can deal with them if you believe that a fellow member of council has a conflict of interest. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But in a nutshell, we are asked often of how to force a council member to declare a conflict of interest. Short answer is you can't. But there are steps, like I said, that you can encourage appropriate behavior. You can have an informal conversation with that member. You can formally raise your concerns, making a motion, and even requesting a recorded vote. It can be escalated to the point of filing a code of ethics complaint under the Code of Ethics bylaw. Other alternatives is that if you're confident that the council member has not followed the conflict of interest rules, you can attempt to enforce the disqualification through a resolution of council by declaring that member's seat vacant, or as a council, applying to a judge to have that member seat declared vacant. Conflicts of interest or contravention of conflict of interest legislation is grounds for disqualification under the Act. So it's taken very seriously. And I just wanted to put this slide up here of the definition. Council member has a conflict of interest in a matter before council that will further his or her private interests or improperly further those of another person. Every decision that you make as council is to be in the best interest of the municipality. So that improperly furthering those of another person is, looking at, is that decision that we're making for the municipality to the benefit of this individual improperly? Because, they could benefit from it if it's awarding a contract. But if it's to the detriment of the municipality, that's where you might be finding yourself in a conflict of interest situation. And another key point is a conflict of interest is not just limited to a financial interest. It's important to know that when a financial interest is involved, a conflict of interest exists, regardless of the amount of money that is involved. So now, after all of that, how do you handle a conflict of interest? It's actually quite easy. When a matter comes before council that you have a conflict of interest in, or even think you might have a conflict of interest in, you follow these steps. So declare, disclose, abstain, refrain, and leave. So declare that you have a conflict of interest. When you receive your agenda package for your upcoming meeting, take a scan of what that agenda list is and determine, are there matters on this that I'm going to be in conflict with? You might even have, as part of your regular procedures, is that at the beginning of the meeting, everybody makes any declarations of their conflict of interest. I've heard of that being done. But it's important that you declare. The administrator is required to note that in the minutes, that declarations of conflict of interest. Disclose the general nature of what that conflict is. That's important. It's if it's tied to your public disclosure statement as it relates to your spouse's employer, disclose that general nature. You're going to abstain from voting on any question, decision, or recommendation or other action that council is considering about that matter that you're in conflict in. And you're also going to refrain from participating in any discussion regarding that matter, not just in the council meetings, but when you're out at the hockey rink, if you're at the bank and you're approached on it. Refrain from having any discussions on it. And lastly, make sure you leave the room. Leave the room until discussion and voting on the matter has concluded. So again, each step is important and each step is required, and that is for each and every time that matter that you are in conflict on comes before council. So before we get into roles, I didn't see any typing fury in the chat window, so I don't know if we want to pause here, Dustin, for any questions. I'll wait a couple moments and see if there's any that come through, and we can go from there.
Yeah, I hadn't seen any come through either, Megan. Yeah, I think we can carry on, and then as we get to the end of your presentation, we can certainly check again. So just a reminder to folks to put their questions in the chat, and we'll make sure we get to those. There's sometimes some of the best stuff that we get to hear are the questions and the responses.
Exactly. Okay. All right. Well, let's get into the roles as they are stated in the Municipalities Act. Before we get into those specifics, I wanted to highlight this slide, which is actually pulled from our council members handbook. You may be familiar with it since you've taken office. It's available for download on saskatchewan.ca and is a great resource for new and existing council members that kind of really compacts what we talk about today in roles and responsibilities in a handy dandy handbook. But I wanted to highlight that council provides the direction on services and programs and the established policies through resolutions and bylaws. You are the direction givers. Council is the employer. Council is the governing body, and they make decisions for the municipality. By comparison, the administrator is the one that provides the advice and ensures that the decisions and the directions of council are implemented. And obviously, you need to have some pretty good teamwork to do that well. The administrator is the employee of the municipality. They are neutral. And like I said, they implement the decisions. They don't make the decisions for the municipality. That is council's role. So when we talk about the specifics for the role of council members, the Municipalities Act sets out the general duties of everyone on council, so including the reeve. You are to represent the public in their best interests. You're to participate in developing policies, programs, and services. You're to participate in meetings. And that's not just showing up, it's participating in the debate and discussions and those decisions. Ensure that administrative practices and procedures are in place. So think about your council meetings and reports that are submitted to you at your council meeting for consideration. You get a monthly financial statement, probably, to review your list of accounts and how much detail goes into that. Those are the administrative practices that you're going to ensure are in place for your municipality. Again, keep matters or private matters confidential and maintain the municipality's financial integrity. You'll see a lot of those actually tie back into the purposes of a municipality that we talked about earlier. But this slide is missing one very important duty, is that elected officials should not involve themselves in those day-to-day operations of the municipality. In a different section, council members actually, it's explicit that they cannot be employees of the municipality, nor can they act as an employee. Like I said before, they are the decision makers, the policy makers, not the action takers. So leave the operations of the municipality to your staff. And this is a really important reason as to why to have an organizational chart. So your citizens, they put their trust in each of you and elected you to office to make those decisions on their behalf. They selected you as the leaders, and they want decisions that are made in the best interests of their municipality. I guess one other thing I wanted to touch on is that council being accountable to their voters. The decisions are owned by the council as a whole, even if you individually do not agree or vote for a specific action. Voters have a right to ask you questions, hear how and why that you have made the decisions that you've made, and speak to you about changes to a decision or a current policy. And we're going to talk about the public a little bit later in this presentation. But ultimately, yes, your role is the decision maker. The role of the reeve, in addition to those general duties that we just saw on the previous slide, the reeve also has the following duties according to the Act. So they are to chair council meetings. They are to act as ex officio of all committees unless otherwise provided for by council. They are also considered the head under the Local Authority Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. When it comes to tax enforcement, the list of land in arrears in your municipality is presented to the reeve. The Municipalities Act requires that the reeve must sign bylaws and minutes. And when it comes to checks, contracts, and other instruments, it can be the reeve, but it can also be another member of council that signs those. It's a person designated by council. Now, when we talk about the administrator, we talked about this earlier, but they are to advise council on their legislative responsibilities and operational matters. And they provide for the overall administration of the municipality. Administrators must be qualified according to the profession's Board of Examiners. So in this case, the Rural Board of Examiners. And they require every municipality, the Act requires every municipality to appoint a person to the office of administrator and that they are certified by that Rural Board of Examiners. An RM cannot operate without an administrator unless special permission is granted by the Board of Examiners. And I believe they call that a conditional certificate or a permit. If not otherwise provided for by council, the administrator is responsible for the hiring, suspension, and dismissal of all municipal employees. Administrators are also expected to remain impartial, like I said before, in their role, and ensure that the decisions that are being made by the municipal council are carried out. In addition to the Municipalities Act, an administrator must be aware of any other legislative requirements that apply to their municipality. A significant number of other provincial statutes are under purview of other ministries that require certain basic services or responsibilities or provide more specific authority over certain matters. Something that comes to mind is the Animal Production Act and dealing with stray animals. And I'm not talking cats or dogs, but I'm talking about those of the bovine, equine, stray llamas. I had those when I was an administrator. But there's certain responsibilities under other legislation, not just under our purview under Ministry of Government Relations, that the administrator needs to be aware of and communicate that with their council and carry out their duties under those pieces of legislation. Council is supported in carrying out their duties and responsibilities, particularly by that administrator. They're an integral part of the team. They ensure that the day-to-day operations and direction of council are carried out. I think I've said that a few times, but one of the most important aspects of good municipal governance is an effective working relationship between council and the administrator. The experience and knowledge of the administrator are essential for members of council to perform their role efficiently and effectively. And the public. Lastly, but most importantly, when it comes to discussing roles and responsibilities, we need to discuss the role of the public. So under the Act, there are certain provisions to ensure that public participation, at minimum, that you involve for you provide for with your public. So public have the right to attend and observe any meeting of council or council committees. They have access to your municipal documents, specifically public documents like your minutes after they've been passed, bylaws, the annual audited financial statements, contracts that have been entered into, accounts paid by the municipality, and public disclosure statements that we talked about before. The public also have the right to petition. They can petition for a public meeting on any municipal matter to be held. Sorry, they want to have a public meeting held. They can petition to have a referendum. They can also petition for special audits, such as like a management audit or a financial audit, and that is different from your annual audit that requires to be conducted. Financial audit in that case would be more somewhat or similar to what we would call a forensic audit in plain terms. But those are all rights under the Act for the public to participate in their local level of government. More specifically, when it comes to petitions, there are only certain types of petitions, those that are listed, that bind council to a specific action. So it's something to be aware of. Certain actions of council also require public notice. So some examples would be if you're permanently closing a road, or if you require to borrow money, or when you're setting the remuneration for your council committees and other bodies that are set up by council. The administrator in this case would follow your public notice bylaw and provide notice in the location your bylaw states for the time required in your bylaw. So it could be on a community bulletin board, advertising on your municipal website, or potentially even advertising in a local newspaper. Legislation sets out the minimum standards for what requires to be public notice. There are going to be matters that council will need to decide on that would be best suited to engage with your public first. So something I like to say is that things that are controversial do not become less controversial by not engaging with your public. It actually tends to have the opposite result. So have publicly available documents and information on your website. Encourage citizens to attend your council meetings and make them feel welcome to do so. Use social media, properly. Keep in mind that it is social media, but you can use social media by posting key notices and information, distribution of newsletters with your tax notices. Communicate the facts, and it gives appropriate context to the public to understand the why behind decisions are made. You show how the decision, whether it be a policy, a bylaw, or a process, will impact those residents. Okay. Should I pause here? I feel like I'm flying here, Dustin, going through all these slides, but we can pause before we move into council meetings, or if anybody
Well,
needs a stretch.
that's a good idea. Let's take a minute and just check again here. Yeah, happy to have some questions come in, but if you wanted to take even 30 seconds for folks to stand up and stretch out a little bit, that's probably a good idea. So we'll maybe
I'm not going to lead a
reconvene.
stretching exercise. I promise you
Oh,
that. But
I was looking to you to do that. So
no.
YMCA, do we anyway? Okay, well let's just pause then for a few moments, and folks can turn their cameras off if they need to, or those who are presenting, and we'll just reconvene here in a moment or two.
I was thinking we could have had like the last Saskatchewan pirate for a stretch break, but again, I'm not going to lead that.
No,
But
no,
in
that's
the
fair.
theme of
For
riders
future
winning.
for future educational programming, though, that's the way to break up the presentations. I
Yeah.
like the idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like there's no questions at the moment.
Okay.
I know there's some at the end, so we'll let you finish off what you've got, and we'll reconvene here in a moment or two.
Sounds good. Okay. So council meetings. All right. So all council meetings and council committee meetings are open to the public. Public have a right to observe their local government at work and making the decisions that impact their day-to-day lives. Now, municipalities are required to act through council, which means council must pass resolutions or bylaws or policies by either resolution or bylaw that are held at a duly called meeting. So to hold a council meeting, appropriate public notice must be given. You may not provide notice of every council meeting if you have that set out in your council procedures bylaw, for instance, that it's the second Thursday of the month, every month. And that was what my council was back when I was in the field. You have to have a quorum of council being present, and the administrator or the administrator's designate must be in attendance at that meeting. Something important to remember is that individual council members cannot make decisions alone. You're part of a team, which means the entire council. And when I say decision, it's by doing a resolution at a council meeting or in the case of a bylaw. We often hear, and we know, we're all human, but decisions by email or text message, they're not acceptable. Emails and text take away from the public's right to participate in their municipal government, which is also not demonstrating openness and transparency. Decisions can only be made by resolutions or a bylaw. And if a decision that has to be made, it's made on short notice, your best option is call a special meeting, or if possible, wait till the next regular meeting. What I find in my experience, many cases, text or email messages often relate to operational matters, where council could set a policy that authorize or directs the administrator of how to handle those various matters. So something I can think of is you get a call complaining that a road has not been graded yet, or snow hasn't been removed yet. Now, having a snow removal policy will direct your outside crew of the priority list of how those roads are to be graded. And you're not on a one-off calling the operator to head over to this township road on the fly because it hadn't been graded yet. You have a set policy. You have to keep in mind, they may not necessarily like the answer to it, but at least they know what to expect, and that the municipality has a plan of how they're going to handle snow removal. if I can't, or I'll emphasize this even more, no resolution or bylaw equals no decision of council. So resolutions would be your business operations, day-to-day activities. Bylaws, more regulatory in nature. Some bylaws are legislated to be required, things like when you're closing a street or road, if you're using tax tools, if you're setting rates and fees for public utilities, and they're meant for use for a longer term. Whenever you're doing a bylaw, use of legal services to review a drafted bylaw is always a good investment, because who's going to defend your bylaw if you're challenged on it? You're going to need some legal advice and help with that. And as I stated before, individual council members have no authority to act independently. So what does that mean? An action taken on behalf of a municipality needs to be a decision of council, not a decision of a councillor. Legislation states that a member of council who knowingly makes an expenditure for a municipality that is not authorized by council, and to be authorized by council, there would be a resolution in place, they are liable to the municipality for the expenditure. So as an example, if you decided to purchase a mower for the municipality without prior approval because you found a good one that was a good deal, you may find that you're responsible to pay the price of that mower out of your personal funds. You know, there's a lot of risk if you've made that decision by text message that, you know, you might have 4 of your 7 council members on board through a text message to buy that mower. And then when it comes to the meeting time in a week and you want to ratify that decision later with a resolution, well, now maybe only 3 members are in support and that resolution would be lost. So keep in mind of making decisions outside of council meetings as well as acting independently. And policy, I know Roy is going to be talking a lot about this, so I won't focus on it too much, but the differences between bylaws, resolutions, and policies and motions, they are often, they can be a common source of confusion. A council should enact a bylaw for more important matters, such as actions that affect residents or that may require intervention by the courts, where you have an enforcement piece. Think of a nuisance bylaw. It may be less common in rural municipalities, I understand that, but you may have a nuisance abatement bylaw to enforce where untidy properties and so on. Council has the discretion to develop policies that provide further guidance on matters of importance to the municipality, but policies have limitations regarding their enforcement and how they're applied. So some examples of policy I kind of touched on before is a snow removal policy. Maybe you have a policy for a leave of absence for your staff, or a travel policy, how you handle travel for council members attending conventions or training. So it's not just lost in a resolution in the minutes from 10 years ago. Have it as a policy and review it and update it as needed. Going back to council meetings. So all municipalities are required to have a bylaw that establishes the general procedures to be followed in conducting business at council meetings. And this is commonly referred to as a council procedures bylaw. All council members and staff must be familiar with the contents of that bylaw and have it available during meetings for quick reference. Legislation requires that the bylaw includes rules for the conduct of your members of council, rules about confidentiality, transparency, openness, and the accessibility of documents and other matters that are going to be discussed by or presented to council. So as an example, your bylaw may state that council receives the agenda package 5 days before the regular council meeting, and that the public has access to that 2 days prior to the council meeting. That's an example of what you might have in your council procedures bylaw. You'll also have to have rules about delegations or presentations or submissions. Maybe it's well, in that example I just gave, that any delegations or presentations to be made at your meetings need to be registered with the administrator at least 5 days prior. You know, you may feel that that's too long of a window, but how does council adequately prepare to have that delegation before them and know the material that's going to be presented to be able to discuss and respond to? Other things that you're going to have in your bylaw are the days, times, places of your regularly scheduled meetings. And procedures for calling a special meeting, including designating a person to call a special meeting if you're without an administrator. That has to be in there. Rules for closing all are part of the meeting, and we're going to get into that a little bit further. The procedure to appoint a counselor as deputy reeve if the reeve is unable to perform their duties, as well as the procedure to appoint a counselor. Oh, sorry, I already said that. Yeah, sorry, procedure to appoint a counselor as acting reeve if they are unable to perform their duties. I think I saw a question pop up in the chat, and then I see in the Q&A there might be some there too. So a question of, can a counselor call a special meeting or just the administrator? So it is the majority of council or the reeve can request a special meeting to be called, and the administrator is the one that calls it, so to speak. They're the ones that are required to post the notice, and if it has to be within 24 hours, sign the waiver. I actually think we've got that slide coming up. So if you just bear with me, we'll cover that in a little bit. And if you have more questions, let me know. Before we get into the special meetings, I want to talk about closed session, because you've heard me say that council meetings are open to the public. But the legislation also contemplates that there are going to be occasions when a portion of the meeting or an entire meeting needs to be closed to the public. So it's very specific of when council can move to a closed session. It's either for long-range strategic planning or where you have obligations under the LaFoIP or privacy legislation. So things like third-party information, specific records from other governments or law enforcement agencies. If you have a legal matter for solicitor-client information, if you're dealing with personnel or human resource matters, those are appropriate times to go into closed sessions. When you're in a closed session, no resolutions can be made, and what is discussed is confidential. Something I like to reflect on is, I worked in a municipality where the public didn't attend our council meetings very often. And when we went and had to discuss something that was confidential, like if we had a legal matter that we needed to discuss, we needed to be sure that we moved to go into a closed session or in-camera session because that protects that conversation. If we had not moved into a closed session, anything that was discussed during that time was open for a council member to go and talk about. So you need to be conscious of that. Just because the public isn't physically there, you still need to make a motion to go into closed session and protect that conversation, keeping it confidential. Now, like I said, legislation provides the ability to have closed or an in-camera session for a reason. Just don't abuse it. If the public thinks that things are done secretly, there's a greater risk that the public is losing confidence in their elected council. And the more informed council or citizens are about the decisions and operations of the municipality, the less conflict and questions that you are going to need to manage. And again, matters discussed in closed or in-camera sessions are confidential, and no resolutions can be passed during that time. Okay, so back to special meetings. So a special meeting is called by the administrator at the request of either the reeve or a majority of council members. Your council procedures bylaw may actually also have a form that needs to be submitted in order to have that special meeting called, and the signatures required on it. So make sure to double check that. So when the administrator receives a request for a special meeting, it would be for a specific agenda item or items. And that's what you're limited to discuss for that special meeting. They must provide at least 24 hours written notice to all council members, and they have to post a notice to the public listing what those specific agenda items are. You can only discuss those items that are on your agenda, unless all of council is present at that special meeting and all consent to discuss any other matter and do that by resolution to show the consent. Now, sometimes in an urgent situation, a special meeting needs to be held and it's less than 24 hours. It's public notice is not possible. So in those circumstances, all council members are required to sign a waiver to hold the meeting without adequate notice, and then whether those council members are able to attend the meeting or not. If there's a missing signature from a council member, you cannot proceed with having that special meeting within the 24 hours. And as soon as you know that the meeting is going to proceed, the administrator should post the notice for the public in the usual place, even though you can't meet that over 24-hour timeline. Now, I don't know if there's any additional questions with that, but I hope that answered the question given. Because next I'm going to move into resources. But Dustin, you might need to help me out with this. I just opened up the question Q&A. Oh, no questions at this time. Perfect. All right. Yep. So let's slide into resources here. Just a quick highlight of the Municipal Peer Network, MPN for short. So the Ministry of Government Relations and the municipal associations came together and recognized that there's a benefit and in the potential for having a program where support is available and provided in a mentor-mentee type of relationship. So it's a network of experienced administrators and elected officials who have graciously made themselves available to provide advice and offer suggestions on how to handle issues when they arise. Now, they're available to listen to your issues and act as a sounding board. They can provide advice towards raising issues more publicly. They might give you some suggestions on how to handle based on their past experience. But they're not mediators or arbitrators, and they do not provide conflict dispute resolution. But a lot of the calls that they receive relate to relationships, public input, and disagreements. Their calls are confidential, any communications that you have with them, and they're easy to access. And best thing is they're free of charge. So you'll see the website address here, saskpeernetwork.org. I encourage you to visit that website, and the individual contact information for all the municipal peers is available on that website. So you can pick whom you would like to reach out to when the case may be. Ombudsman Saskatchewan, I'm not going to talk too much about their office just because we have Niki Smith from the Ombudsman's office joining you later this afternoon. But I'm going to promote their website as well as contacting their office. They are appointed by the Legislative Assembly to address and resolve complaints from citizens regarding the fairness of decisions of municipalities, but they also provide training as well, and I'll let Niki talk more about that. Please visit their website. My advisory services team like to point people that have inquired with us to their website for further information. So please do that. You heard me mention the Privacy Commissioner. I think I did. If not, I was talking about LaFoIP, the Local Authority Freedom of Information Protection and Privacy Act. So Saskatchewan Information and Privacy Commissioner, they oversee that legislation, which establishes access to information as well as privacy rights of citizens for local authorities such as municipalities. Now, please visit their website. They have all their reports of investigations that they've done. They have a wonderful blog of things to consider when, as an elected official, even when it comes to privacy and your role as an elected official. See, this is my time. I have 4 slides left, so I'm going to stop tripping over my words soon. Lastly, Government of Saskatchewan website, simple as saskatchewan.ca. We have a dedicated page called Municipal Administration where you're going to find everything from sample bylaws to guides to information bulletins, things about planning and development, building and technical standards, building bylaws. The world's your oyster when you go to that website. But I'll also highlight when you go to the Government of Saskatchewan website, the search bar is your friend. So make sure to use that. It's the "What are you looking for" on the upper right corner. And if you have a hard time finding something online, make sure to give us a call. I'll have my contact information on the next slide here. But last thing to highlight is Search Council Members Handbook. We updated this last fall at the time of the general elections. It's a great resource for not only new council members, but those that have been in the role and need a refresher or would like a refresher. And here's our contact information. Again, I'm the manager of our advisory services unit. I have a team of very capable, qualified and municipal advisors that will provide you with technical advice of what's in the Municipalities Act, and being former administrators, draw from some of their experiences to help those conversations. At the end of the day, what comes out of those conversations is still going to be what you take out of it and how you apply it, but we're definitely a resource available to you. You can contact us at that phone number. Just make sure to leave your message with your phone number and we'll give you a call, or you can email advisoryservices@gov.sk.ca. And on that note, thank you very much for your time and attention. I'll pause for a little bit if there's any questions that come in, and otherwise I'll leave it at that.
Hey, thank you, Megan. It's always remarkable to think about the amount of information there is to know, hey, with coming onto council, and just the amount of things that maybe people aren't familiar with, but end up needing to be when they begin their work in office. There were a few questions that, you and I have talked about in the past, and I wondered if, while we're waiting for other folks to put their questions in the chat, if they've got any, we could talk about a few of those.
Sure.
Okay. One of the questions pertains to that public disclosure statement. If a person is renting out their land, does that need to get listed on the public disclosure statement?
So I'm just going to bring up the section of the Act. And for those that like to look it up themselves, it's section 142. And I'm looking at subsection 2, where it says a public disclosure statement must contain. And one of the clauses is the general nature and any material details of any contract or agreement involving the member of council or someone in the member's family that could be reasonably perceived to be affected by a decision, recommendation, or action of the council, and to affect the member's impartiality in the exercise of his or her office. So it is asking that the general nature of any contract or agreement that the member is in is disclosed that can be reasonably perceived to be affected by a decision. So one of the situations I can think of is a council member has retired. They've rented out all of their land, and they've rented it to 2 different local farmers in the area. And one of those farmers has maybe a development application that's come before council for consideration. And so there may be no malfeasance or improper mindset of being in that decision that they're not going to favor. However, you got to think of perception. What would the public see if they know that you rent to that individual and you're participating in deciding if that development is to proceed or not? So
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I realize that and I know that not all council members are in the agricultural industry, but that is a common one, or even when they have contracts for selling their grain with a local terminal. So it's something to be conscious of. Ultimately, you decide what you're putting on that public disclosure statement, but that is what is expected under the Municipalities Act.
Okay, Megan, thank you for that. Another question for you, again, one that you and I have discussed in the past and has come up a few times, about council having a meeting without the administrator present. Is that a thing?
Unfortunately, we've heard that it's happened.
Yeah.
But it's not a duly constituted meeting if you don't have an administrator present to record that meeting
Mm,
occurring. And it's, to address an elephant in the room, I understand there's sometimes council wants to discuss matters that involve their administrator or potentially job performance. And what you would have is that meeting, you can go into a closed session, and your council procedures bylaw should outline that it is council that determines who participates during that closed session period and ask the administrator to leave during that time.
right. So a portion of the meeting could be
Yeah.
without the administrator, but certainly there can't be a meeting
Yeah.
as a whole without it.
Yeah. Any decisions that are made as an outcome of that closed session need to be recorded as a resolution in the minutes. Council would have an option potentially to appoint a designate, somebody as the administrator for recording that motion. It's a slippery slope, but ultimately administrator definitely, they're required to ensure that minutes are recorded of all meetings. They may have a designate already set. Maybe there's an assistant administrator that attends on the administrator's behalf when they're not present.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question for you. Are councils required to have an annual ratepayers meeting?
No, they're not, but I
Okay.
highly encourage you to consider it.
Right.
It is a great way to engage with your municipality, with your voters, with your citizens, so they know what the plans are for the upcoming year. I think it actually used to be required. Forgive me, I'd have to dig back, but under the Rural Municipalities Act. But it's not a requirement. But think about if you've got major projects going on or large purchases, or if you've had shifts in assessment and you want to communicate it on a bigger scale. Those are great opportunities to engage with your public, because they get to ask their questions. You get to share information, and yeah, overall, when the voters or citizens are involved in discussions on those, they're less likely to probably be upset that they didn't know something later down the road. So whether it's a public meeting or a municipal website, if it's a newsletter, public engagement is key and expected.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it makes good sense. Megan, I think what we'll do is we'll stop there. I haven't seen any other questions come in. You're welcome to stick around, and of course, if questions come through that we wanted to forward to you, I'll be happy to do that.
Yes.
I, of course, can't speak highly enough about your work and the work of your team. Even staff at SARM have reached out to advisory services for advice and input into, how we support RMs and other municipalities. And I know that when we've encouraged folks to reach out to you, they're usually pretty happy with the kind of support that they're given. So thank you for taking time today, but also for the work that you do on a day-to-day basis.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Enjoy the rest of the session, everyone. And yes, if there's any questions, please feel free to either send them to Dustin to pass along to me, or you can use that contact information there. So,
that's great, Megan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're running slightly ahead of schedule, nothing too much though. And so what I'd like to do is invite Roy Anderson to join us. Roy is going to be speaking on his presentation, Understanding the Lanes, Effective Council Staff Relationships. And so I feel particularly privileged to have gotten to know Roy a little bit over the last year or two here as we've worked on a couple of projects that we both had a lot of interest in. Roy's wealth of knowledge when it comes to governance is pretty astounding. And he's able to communicate it and also coach with it in a way that I think really connects with where people are at and the kind of advice that they need. So Roy is president of R. Anderson and Associates, a management consulting practice providing professional services in Saskatchewan. The firm specializes in public and stakeholder consultation programs, strategic facilitation and strategy development, program design, change management planning and implementation frameworks, and board council development planning. Roy continues to work with both rural and urban municipal sectors in Saskatchewan, providing guidance on strategic planning, program development, policy, and council governance. So, I hope by the introduction it's obvious why Roy is joining us today, and I'm really excited that those folks on the call will have the opportunity to learn from him today. So, Roy, I'll leave it to you to lead this next piece.
Thanks a lot, Dustin, and thanks for that introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. That bio is great, but it's spread over 30 years of working in private practice. So it's been great to be able to work in the municipal sector over the last decade. I've learned a lot and had a lot of opportunities. And I appreciate the chance to speak with everybody this afternoon and share a little bit of my thoughts on the topic, which is sort of roles and relationships. Just as a point of introduction, as Dustin mentioned, I have a private consulting practice here in Saskatchewan, and have worked over the last couple of decades with different sectors, and had the opportunity to start working in the municipal sector a little bit over a decade ago, and have found it to be very interesting, and primarily have focused on capacity development, strategic planning within the sector. As it says on the slide here, I want to make it clear right off the bat that I have no direct municipal experience. So as a consultant, I can study things and observe things and suggest things, but I never want to proclaim that I really understand how things are working directly at the council table. I've never sat on council, and I've never worked in a municipal office. So I want to make that clear right off the bat. I'm a little bit removed. So hopefully what I talk about today isn't at odds with some of the realities that happen around the council table. Of course, I've participated in council meetings, both as a consultant and as a resident, but my limit is from the consulting side. As I mentioned, I've had the opportunity to consult with the municipal sector over the last primarily 10 to 12 years. And I do talk, for those of you that may know me, I talk a lot about governance, and I talk a lot about policy and policy-based governance, which I know is everybody's favorite topic. But the last point here, I did work as a CEO. I've been a private consultant since the late 80s, but for 6 years, I did step out of private business and took a job with a provincial organization in Regina. So I did work as a chief executive officer for 6 years, and I worked under a policy-based governance model. And I'd like to say that I learned, working as a CEO under that policy model, I learned a lot about the value and benefit that policy structure can bring. And then I also learned, which I hate to say, I also learned where all the gaps were and the areas where it didn't function so well. So that sort of expertise or that experience, it wasn't expertise, that experience sort of led me into this path. And a couple of years after I had resigned from that position, I got a few calls from people asking if I would come out and share my experience working under policy governance. And that sort of opened up added that new brick to my consultancy, and I started to work more on governance and policy. This is a very important topic. Roles and relationships within the municipal sector is a critical, very, very important topic at this point in time, and there's lots of space and lots of opportunity to improve. We do know from studying the sector in 2024 that the pace of change that has been experienced within the municipal sector is significant. And we also know that most of you feel that pace of change is increasing. So it's not only that there's more change coming, it's coming at a more of a rapid pace. And this has the potential to create issues on efficiency and effectiveness, and at the core of that, sort of the theme of this discussion today, at the core of it is a solid and foundational basis of roles and responsibilities within the council. If those are clear and addressed and prescribed in the right way, it allows councils to be nimble, it allows them to move quick, it allows them to be effective and efficient, et cetera, et cetera. If there isn't clarity around those respective roles and relationships, you simply can't work as well as you can if that question is addressed. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that whole thing today. And most importantly, I'm not going to talk about the what. Like Megan did a good job of talking about the prescribed roles of council and administration. I'm going to talk more about how you might work towards defining those and what benefits you can get by applying policy and having these discussions around policy to create that shared and common view into who's doing what. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope. I got to give some background on governance models and the what's and whys. I want to talk about, I'm kind of interested, I haven't really thought about this or put it down until thinking about this presentation, the difference in the rural municipalities world compared to corporate or nonprofit boards versus councils, and why we have to think about the approach or the application of policy governance with those differences in mind, right? There's no use in banging everybody on the head about this is the way it's got to be if it's not going to fit within the sector's world. So while I may stretch a little bit from what consultants have been saying over the last 2 decades, I think I have a pretty good argument for a different consideration about how we apply policy. So a little background on that. Role definition. I've never really talked about the processes of delegation, but I did some research in anticipation of this discussion today and got a little bit to talk about that. And then, of course, I want to talk about policy. So we're going to spend the balance of the time I have today with you just talking about the entry point for policy and how it might apply or provide opportunities for our municipality. And again, talking about how as opposed to what. And I hope that anything I say isn't at odds with the prescribed or legislative rules around roles and responsibilities. I think I'm working within that space and I want to make everybody understand that. I'm not suggesting that the overriding legislation and the rules that Megan spoke to should be changed. So as a starting point, and the reason I bring this up is because in my work, I bump into, whether I'm working with boards or working with councils, or just out there talking with people, I always bump into people, when you say the word policy, they automatically talk about the Carver model. And they automatically start to back up and say, we want nothing to do with talking about policy or the Carver model. And I think we lay that at the feet of consultants like myself to a degree over the years that have promoted this model as the new way that organizations and to a degree municipalities should be approaching things. So I just want to talk a little bit about these two things as sort of the foundation. The Carver model was developed, I don't know, 2 or 3 decades ago, and it was developed because there was a need to approach governance differently. So Carver, and I believe Carver and his wife, they were 2 experts or academics in this area. So they developed this Carver model. And in the most general sense, it's governance through policy. So everything is written down. The rule book is established. The relationship that exists between the board or council and a CEO or CAO is very clear. They have one employee. So a corporation, for example, that's applying this policy governance model to the T has one employee, and that's the CEO. They have nothing to do with anybody else. And they charge that CEO with full responsibility of the strategic and operational direction of the organization. And they govern them through policy. That's the biggest description. They talk about the board has their own policies to make sure they're doing their job. The board sets the strategic or future direction. This is where we want to go. This is where we want to be. You know, the discussion of this future state or desired state, they talk about that and they define it. And then they set the parameters around what the CEO isn't allowed to do, right? Role definition. We want you to be responsible for this. Do whatever you need to do to get the job done, but don't do this. An example would be, on the financial management, the board might say in policy, do not borrow any money. You're not allowed to borrow any money unless it's approved by the board. That's a restriction. Other than that, go forth and do what you need to do to get the job done. So it's been presented as a very hard-edged approach to policy governance because boards and councils, for example, step back and go, well, what's our job then if we're not allowed to get involved in strategy and operations? And I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the discussion. There's 5 or 6 different types of governance models, but really the 2 that I think are relevant. I wanted to talk about Carver because I'm going to tell you how we can set that aside and how policy can be used as a tool. We don't have to talk about Carver anymore. And then there's a traditional model, which lots of organizations were operating under, and lots of organizations still do. And I would suggest to a great degree, there's a number of rural municipalities that operate under this traditional model where the board or council is very involved in day-to-day decision making. They're hands-on, they're in the kitchen, the phrase that we use, they're in there, they're helping make decisions on a regular basis. So they're basically operational. Processes and policies might be defined in a bylaw, for example, in the municipal setting, but the operational questions and decisions that are being addressed on a rolling basis are addressed by council and not specifically by the CAO. So there's constant tension between these two models. I've got a couple of notes here, you know, in terms of boards and councils pushing back and saying, we don't see what our role is here for delegating everything to the CAO. A little bit of a misunderstanding, again, that might relate to the way this is being presented. So what I'm suggesting is, you know, the textbook application of the Carver model, I just say no. And I've been saying that for about the last 10 years. When somebody asks me about the Carver, I just say, I don't even want to talk about it, because there are a lot of issues related to the textbook application of how it works, leads to confusion and misunderstanding. If there's a lot of hand-holding and support throughout a transition process to it, the model still is the best practice. It's just that there's lots of bumps along the road. So I just mentioned giving thought to what's different on the municipal landscape compared to a corporation or a nonprofit or not-for-profit. And, you know, thoughts or perspectives on these, I think, are important, because again, it's just from observation. And I gave this some thought a couple days ago in terms of, you know, what would I put down here? And this first bullet is about the REIV playing the role of the CEO. And I know, as Megan talked about in the previous presentation, the REIV's not allowed to they're not allowed to be paid to be the CEO. You know, I think legislation doesn't allow that. However, just in observation and what I've heard in discussion was that there are, in situations, the REIV is sort of playing the de facto CEO role, where they have, whether it's clear or policy based, they have some influence on decisions that they make throughout the operations throughout the year. They kind of maybe see themselves as the CEO of the municipality. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly, but they're playing that role. Whereas in, you know, policy-based governance that not-for-profits use, for example, they don't have a REIV, they would have a chair. They don't even have a president. They have a chair, and the chair has no more authority than any other board member does. They basically are the spokesperson. They chair the meetings. They stay in close contact with the executive director or CEO, but they can't make any decisions or guide anything unless those are specifically prescribed by the board in policy. But it rarely happens. They are a board member. It just happens that they sit as the chair. In the corporate environment, it can be a little bit different, where you've got a board. You know, if you've got a market-based corporation, that it's all about, you know, where's our market share at? What's the price per share? If their focus is on making money, sometimes you have a president who does have prescribed sets of roles that are different than a board member, but they're paid to do that. You know, you have a president and a CEO and their executive positions. With rural municipalities, legislation doesn't allow for that, but the REIV can and often does play the role of the CEO. So we need to recognize that and understand that. The scale of the team and the competencies and skills may be different between, I wouldn't say in a common sense against not-for-profits or nonprofits. Lots of them have challenges in terms of the capacity that they have and the team that they have to work for the organization. But we need to recognize that this isn't a corporation where you've got a director of HR, you've got a director of finance, you got a director of all these sorts of things within a corporation. So it's a key consideration when you're talking about roles and responsibilities and where they sit, is that the competency mix, there may be gaps in that, so we need to talk about that. And the third one is the connections with owners. You know, whereas a corporation, they're not really having discussions with the people that are buying their products to a great degree. Non-for-profit, they might be representing some big sector of some organization or something like that, but the board itself isn't regularly talking to specific members. They're responsible for what we call linkage with owners, but in a rural municipal setting, your elected officials, they're talking with owners being the ratepayers. They're their neighbors. They bump into them. They get onto the council because they're representing a division. So they're in close contact with with the people on the landscape, the ratepayers, the owners, and they've got relationships with them, and the historic relationship and role of the elected official. There's history there, and there's precedent there in terms. I got a problem. Would you go and take care of this? Elected official historically may have always said, yeah, sure, I'll go take care of it. I'll go and talk to them right now. We'll get it solved. So we have to, rightly or wrongly, again, we have to understand that that's the reality that sits within, or at least it's an observation that I tried to map here against the difference, the things we have to think about when we think about the rural municipal landscape and defining roles and responsibilities. So, role of council. While I'm not here to talk about the prescribed role of council, I wanted to talk about 4 of these pieces. They're contained in the SEEDS module, one of the SEEDS modules in that program. I think the President mentioned it in his opening address here at the start of this, and Dustin's mentioned it a couple times. A great program, if you're not familiar with it. Great 8 great modules that you can walk through that are going to give you some tips on your role as a council and broader than that. These are the 4 that are outlined in there. Again, they're underneath that umbrella of the legislative requirements, but these 4 are kind of tips on the role of council that we'd expect, that we've suggested for councillors that are suggested in the module. Writing and following the playbook. Write it down. I'll say that a million times. Write it down. This is policy. What are the set of tools that guide what you do as a council? Not just the ones that are from the legislation and down, but what are your practices and what do they look like? Write them down. Repeatable, consistent processes that you can go through to help you govern better. Working with a qualified administrator, hands down. Nothing needs to be saying more than a council's greatest resource. It allows you to start to delegate, or provide you the opportunity to delegate if you've got that strength working with you. Fiduciary oversight, been talked about already to the greatest extent. There's different components around fiduciary oversight. Again, the SEEDS modules talk about these a little bit, but in general, you're responsible for the money, right? And then the value for money. So that oversight is critically important from a governance perspective. And then, of course, the law and compliance. So making sure that you are compliant with everything that the laws prescribe. And if I was to draw a line back up to that, working with a qualified administrator, this is one of the benefits you get from a qualified and informed administrator, is they should be aware and familiar with, council should be as well, but they are your resource to say, I understand all the legislation, all the related acts, and yes, we're in compliance with them, or just a minute, we're stepping outside of the boundaries here. And, you know, we've heard of different stories of municipalities, urban or rural, over the last, 5 to 6 years that have stepped outside of compliance, either with purpose or with unfamiliarity with what the rules are. But so those are 4 pretty important pieces. Again, all under the umbrella of the legislation, but the things to think about. Are we doing everything in a consistent fashion, and do we know that? Well, it's tough to answer that question if it's not written down. 2:35. I'm not sure what time we started, Dustin, so I'll just keep going.
Yeah, we're in good time. We started about, I guess it was about 25 after. So take your time. I think we were good. I've been monitoring the chat, not seeing any questions come in there, but I'm sure there'll be some when the presentation's all over too.
It's really good. Okay. I tend to speak a little fast, so maybe I'll just try and slow down a little bit here. We don't have a hard end, so thanks, Dustin. So this topic again is all about roles and responsibilities, and I've talked about the fact that how do we define these, not specifically what they are, but how do we define these? And defining the role of your CEO or your administrator, and then I realized today, I don't know if it's Chief Administration Officer or Administrative Officer, so I've got that wrong. I apologize, but you've sort of got this continuum, and this is the point of discussion for council. This is what you have to start to think about. The far side to the right of this continuum, you've got your CEO or administrator being solely responsible for strategy and operations. So that would be the best practice that policy model would prescribe. Allow your CEO, once you provide them with the direction and define the sandbox or the playing field for them, allow them to charge forward with the details of the strategy and then the details around how it'll be operationally fulfilled. And then at the other end, you have I just use the term basic administration. You may have an administrator that is focused in on some of the critical but more basic administrative functions, like the banking and record keeping and these sorts of things. And I just mean you've got a different range there. And back to this discussion about the full application of the best practice of the model. What I'm suggesting is I know municipalities may be thinking about this already, but we should be thinking about the fact that it's somewhere on this continuum. If you achieve or reach that point where you charge the CAO with strategy and operations, again, you've hit gold. I mean, that's the best practice. That's where you want to arrive. And just on that, and I work with boards, and when we get into this discussion about policy, and when a board member wants to kind of get into the policy and say, I don't agree with this, like we should have some control and some decision making around the specific piece. I always say, you have a chief executive officer that you're paying really well, and you hired them based on all these competencies that they had that you feel match what you need. Download the responsibility on them. Do you want to be responsible for HR? Think about it. Or would you rather delegate that to somebody and say, you've got the tools, you've got the direction, we're guiding you on what we expect, now go get it done. You are responsible. So that's a key question you always have to ask. I always ask boards, and they always land in the right place going, yeah, you know what? I don't want to be responsible for that. I don't understand it. So yeah, it's better that we let the CEO do it. So I'm hitting this maybe a little bit too hard, but that's that best model. And then the other side is the basic administration. So where on the continuum, what's the first steps in terms of on the continuum that councils may want to start talking about? What pieces of the work are we comfortable delegating to our CAO? So that's when that whole topic about delegation popped into my head. One of the most important considerations here, as I've said here, it's got to be balanced against the roles and responsibilities of council or individual council members. So this is maybe breaking with tradition here, but ultimately you could have council providing an individual council member with authority and responsibility for a piece of work. They can't get paid, I understand that, or decision making. As long as it was written and defined in policy, which was supported and had insight and shared support from the entire council, it could happen, I guess, is what I'm saying. Practice could allow for that. So the threat is whether it's the threat is not to have it at one end or the other end. It's just where's the sweet spot, and how can we make sure that there aren't any gaps in the responsibility, in understanding who is actually responsible for the role, who has the role and who's responsible for it. Clarity around that. I'll talk a little bit more as we jump forward about the competency question as well, which is a key consideration, I think, when you're fitting on this. But what I'm trying to say with this continuum is the opportunity is to stop thinking about we have to download all strategy and operations to the CAO. Again, that's best practice. But if you're not going to go there, the important thing is to understand, okay, who has the role and who's responsible for it, and how is that defined through policy, so everybody understands where we're at. I got a few notes I've scribbled on the printout here. So this is the piece on the principles of delegation. And again, this just popped into my head a few days ago when I was thinking about this discussion this morning. And when you do the Google thing and research this, of course, they're talking about delegation most often within a big organization, delegation from senior management to mid-management, or management to lower management, or lower management to the front end, all over. And how do you do that? How do you delegate appropriately and with success in mind? But some of these pieces, I've shortened this, there's the 7 steps to delegation and the 6 steps to delegation, and all the way down to the 3. So I thought the sweet spot had 4. So and I guess this is a bit of a guide for councils to start thinking about. If we're not clear on what we're delegating to the CAO or to the administrator, if it's not written down, let's start to have that discussion. Let's start going down the road. So the first step is, what's the task? Task is maybe not the right word here. It might be function. but what's the right function? And I would suggest when I was looking at this morning, it says capacity and competencies. It's likely more relevant to the third bullet than the first bullet. So council, you could sit down and start to think about a task that maybe you feel you shouldn't be doing. It's a repetitive task. There's the risk to basically delegating it is minimal with good clarity. It's occupying time. So maybe it's something you should think about passing down, formalizing and passing down. That's the first discussion. Then the second discussion is, what does success look like in that task? What do we want to happen in that task? And that's an open discussion, again, that needs to be written down. So you have a clear and shared view into, if we pass this down, these are our expectations. This is what we want to happen if we delegate the responsibility for that task. It has to meet this. So there's that discussion. And then the third question is who? And growing an organization, we got a bunch of people. That's a key question. But here would be to identify the right person or the position for the task. And I would suggest here the capacity and competencies. Again, the model would suggest you're handing that task. The starting point is to hand the task off, from my perspective, to the CAO or the administrator. If there's a reason you shouldn't do that, then you maybe have that discussion. But that's your first point. This is where the question of competency comes in. And I have had discussion and experience, direct discussions and experience with municipalities sitting at their table talking about HR. I'm going to talk about HR a little bit because it's an interesting topic, where you want to delegate HR to the CAO, which was discussed earlier in the slide for Megan. That's great. But then the next question is, does the CEO have experience in that competency? And I think there are rural municipalities and urbans where that responsibility is delegated to the CEO without the council's support and recommendation that the CEO ensures that they develop the competencies needed to manage that task. So it's not only the right person in the position, point number 3 here, it's do they have the competencies? And if we still want to assign it, what are we going to do to ensure those competencies are built to help them be successful? Or else the whole thing's not going to work. So it's a key question there. And remember to scribble that down if you take a look at this slide deck down the line. Competencies is really related to that third point. And the final one is supervision. Policy governance incorporates a process where you're always asking the question. So you define what the task is going to look like. You know what you want success to look like. You've identified the person that's going to do it. You've ensured that they've got the competencies, and then fire away, let them go do it. But then on a regular basis, you ask them to come back and say, how are you doing in that task? Here's the policy we wrote that outlined the desired results and what we didn't want you to do. Now, are you in compliance in all this? Is everything working? And you may have experienced in the work as an elected official or as an administrator, where the first time you talk about something is when it goes wrong, when something goes wrong. That's when it pops. There's a red flag. Something's broken all of a sudden. You never have the opportunity to talk about it when things are functioning smoothly, or to anticipate where things might go wrong in the future. This is why the supervision and monitoring and reporting is very, very important. I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's simply asking the question. It doesn't occupy a bunch of time, but it's checking in with the person responsible for the task, saying, are you compliant with everything we asked you to do as a council on this position? So that's part of the beauty of policy governance, is it has a whole monitoring piece over top. It's not onerous. It's not a heavy thing. It doesn't expand the agenda of your council or your board. It just makes you ask the question, keep the communication open, and it reduces risk primarily. So as I'm rolling along here, I wanted to share some information that was gleaned from the needs assessment that we did in 2024, because I think it's relevant to this discussion about roles and responsibilities. The needs assessment piece went out. We did one in 2019. We did in 2024. We asked administrators to complete the survey. I think we had north of 125 or something like that administrators that completed it. On the elected side, a little tighter. We had a little bit over 100, I think, was where we came in. So statistical validity was a little broader maybe, but it's still fairly valid, and it provides good indicators. I would suggest good indicators of where the sector is at. So one of the questions we asked was, what's your council's level of interest in capacity training? Because again, I like to sit in that space. I love to talk about capacity training with municipalities. It wasn't that high, to be honest. It's not this chart, but there was, I think, if I recall, over a third of the municipalities or the respondents to the survey said, my council has no interest in capacity training. And there's about 20% that said my entire council's interested, and maybe another 20% that sort of said about half of us are. So there's a gap right now in the interest in capacity training, and that's a broader question, because if there's doesn't matter how many programs we roll out, if the desire isn't there, we're going to bump into a wall. But within that, so that's the answer on capacity and interest. Within that, we asked everybody, okay, what are the things that you would like to know about? And as you can see here, council governance resonated the most with the respondents, right? So the blue bar was, what do I want to learn about? And the gray bar is asking the same person, what do you think your council would like to learn about? So some of these don't surprise you, but HR management, pumped up there pretty good. Council governance, pretty strong, the highest. And you can see policy governance is way over on the left. Along with the theme of what I've been talking about, people might want to talk about governance, but they don't want to talk about policy, although they're kind of connected at the hip, and we just need to get over that concern about the policy side. But you can see there's lots of opportunities. As I started at the start of there's a need to close the gap on this, and there's lots of opportunities. Respective roles. I thought this slide was very relevant to this discussion today. So we asked administrators, we asked elected officials a couple of questions on roles and responsibilities. And you can see the questions are outlined: role understanding, council's understanding of the role of the CAO administrator. One voice. How good is council at speaking as one voice to the council or administrator? So not different councilors saying different things. Role clarity. Does council understand their own role and obligations, and then the respective roles? What's the role of council versus the role of administrator, and how well do people understand that? So you can see in the chart here, the gray represents the responses from administrators, blue representing responses from elected officials. While we might expect that elected officials would say, we're doing good, we're not doing that bad. And we'd expect administrators to maybe say, yeah, you're maybe not doing as good as you think you are. So I find this quite interesting. In any case, if I look whether the response is from the elected official or from the administrator, it's not that great. All right. The way that we do this, the analysis that we do on these responses, if we ask the question, how strong is council's understanding of the role of the CAO administrator? Because they're close to that bar that's labeled 1, overall, it's somewhat strong. If they answered that question, how strong is the understanding of the role of CEO administrator? And if the response was it's strong, it would be at a 2. If it was very strong, it'd be at a 3. So you can see from the findings in this set of questions, there's a pretty big gap. Like at minimum, when I work with clients with information like this, I always say at minimum, we should be at a 2. You should feel you're effective, or you should feel that things are clear. You should feel you have a strong understanding. So the need, again, as I talked at the start of this, the need to close this gap on roles and responsibilities is clearly evident from my perspective. There's lots of opportunities, and I believe there is a reasonable degree of interest in it. Here's some findings about council's role in the day-to-day management and administration of the rural municipality. So far left, you can see that elected are saying, 30% of them are saying, we're very involved. It's interesting that the administrators said 25% of them said they're less involved, but you can see the circle part as you move to the right of that exhibit. We're starting to see that there's delegation to the CEO administrator. It says some delegation, and then to the far right, if you look at these findings, we're saying 1 in 5. Hopefully they're the same ones. The administrators and elected were responding from the same municipality. But 1 in 5 are saying we're delegating the majority of this to the CEO and admin. That's the best practice. That's a good finding. So, cup is half full. 1 in 5, or even add the others, sort of 2 in 5 are starting to move towards that process of delegation, which is promising. I mentioned earlier, is there any questions here? Maybe Dustin, Slide am I on now? Yeah, I just thought maybe a quick pause to see if there's any questions from anybody.
Yeah, I think that's a good time to do that. Let's see here. I'll just check a couple of different places if there's anything new. Yeah, so far so good.
Okay.
I know you and I can certainly chat about a lot of these things because I'm fascinated by some of the experience that you've had here, and I'm sure that'd be really rich for our members. But I'll let you get through your slides, and then maybe if there's no questions, then I'll have some for you.
Yeah, sounds good, Dustin. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. This next slide here on the HR file. I got very interested in the HR piece within the municipal landscape. We did a focus group, and it was with elected officials, and it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm sorry, I can't remember what the topic. It would have been on capacity training because that's the lane I like to work in. We had 12 elected officials around the table. It was at Regina at one of the events, and it wasn't. The focus group discussion was not on HR. It was on broader capacity. And as we got to the back end of the focus group discussion, HR continued to pop. Everybody started to talk about HR and HR. And the facilitator and I just sort of sat and listened and observed as the participants around the focus group table started to talk with each other about the issues that they were having and frustrations they were experiencing. So I sort of stopped the discussion for a second, and I just asked them, okay, by a show of hands, how many of you have your municipalities that have contracted third parties, either lawyers or HR consultants or somebody like that, to come in to help solve an HR issue that you're experiencing right now? Every single person around the table put their hands up. I found that very, very interesting to realize that, and you can understand, I can understand, you likely all understand it because you work directly in that world, the drain and the stress and the concern that relates to managing the HR file. And let's be real, it's different than it was 20 or 30 years ago, right? Things are different now. Incidents and events that maybe happened in the 80s or the 90s that were sort of off the cuff managed and we moved on. Doesn't happen that way anymore. And again, this is an area of significant amount of change and responsibility and risk and liability. So I sort of did a little bit more research on the HR file. So in the needs assessment, with permission of Dustin and the team, I wanted to ask a specific question around HR because it does show a specific scenario around roles and relationships. So we asked this question about who's holding the HR file. So we wanted to know what percentage of councils were involved in HR and to what degree they were involved in. So this chart shows the blue bar would be their response. They had 4 different options. We're very involved. We're somewhat involved. We delegate some to the CEO and admin, or we delegate the majority of it. HR is their responsibility. And you can see we sort of go down from left to right. So 41% of the respondents, again, elected officials, said they're very involved in general management and administration matters related to HR. So, they're more involved in HR than they are in general management and mid matters. Slide a little bit earlier. So they're very involved in this more than they are involved in anything else. So 41%. The interesting question I see here is that 37% of them say, and we are going to stay very involved in the future, right? That's our space. We're going to stay there. So as we discussed, as Megan discussed in the slide, in terms of the best practice, in terms of the HR matters, staff and everything else, should be part of the CEO or administrators. It's clear here from the responses from elected officials that they're not willing to go there at this point in time. A third of them, 37%, a little bit more than a third, plan to stay very, very involved in this space. So when I reflect on roles and responsibilities, and I'll hit this once more. So if we're saying all of this should be delegated to the CAO, that's the best practice. If in reality that's not going to happen, then how do we modify our thoughts around policy and prescribing and defining roles and responsibilities with that reality in front of us, right? Doesn't make sense to just go, you're not doing it the way you're supposed to do it. Because they'll just say, thanks, but now we'll go away and we'll do it the way we're going to do it. So the opportunity to introduce policy to support maybe these approaches that might not be textbook or best practice, but that's what's happening on the landscape. We need to find a way to let policy support that, I guess, is the point that I'm trying to make. And again, what policy helps, looking on this notes here, my notes, I wanted to make this one point. What policy helps here is if 37%, hypothetical, 37% of elected officials or councils are going to stay in that space, policy would allow clarity to be set on what that means. So, and I like to use this as an example, is if council is responsible for HR, then they are responsible for performance. One doesn't come without the other. So if they hire and fire, specifically if they hire, they can't hire and then turn around and say, okay, chief administrative officer, there's your employee. Now make them work, make them produce, right? I mean, they could, but fundamentally, if you hire the person, you're responsible for them. So these are the types of discussions that have to be held when we're talking about, we're using the example of HR here. If council is going to stay in that space, then how is their specific role and responsibilities defined in that space? You put everybody in a tough position if you hire the person, but then aren't responsible for their performance. So that's an example of a question that policy has to address. And what I'm saying is, well, the best practice is for the council to have clear HR policy written and prepared and given to the CEO. This is the way you will do this. If the CEO is not going to do it, then council needs to have the same thing for themselves. And I might get in a little bit of trouble with other practicing consultants, but that's, to me, it's sort of practice fitting form. If this is the way it's being done, then how can policy make sure that we can still reduce risk? Because as we see there, not all councils are prepared to get away from that HR piece. And it could be because they don't have the competency, back to that competency question. It could be because they don't feel the competencies exist with the CEO or the administrator. So then the path forward for that, as I've already mentioned, is okay, let's build that competency, right? Or if the competency exists at the council table, there's different ways to approach that. Try not to confuse the conversation, but so moving on to, I just have a few more slides here, defining the respective roles. So again, I've talked about this before. Policy is a tool, right? That strict policy model is what's reflected on this page. Council has fiduciary oversight. Council has delegation through policy. They define the devised outcomes. And most importantly, which is overlooked a lot of the time when we talk about this model, is that council are the advisors and the thinkers. So quite often people feel if we follow a policy-based model, myself as a councilor, as a board member, that means I've got nothing to add anymore. My thoughts are not reflected or represented in the discussion. Farthest thing from the truth. The role of council or the role of the board is to serve as advisors. That's one of their key responsibilities. Help frame every discussion so that your CEO and your administrator is further informed and can go away and make the right decisions. And then, of course, is this strict policy model. Everything's delegated to the CEO, which is great. Now, that little line up top there says, strict policy model often used as a weapon rather than a tool. And I've been using this phrase for a number of years. And it is because I've experienced situations where policy models have been built and put in place. And it's quite often the CEO or the CAO that uses policy as a weapon. And by that, what I mean is they'll say, if there'll be an operational question come from the board, come from the council, I'd like to ask this question about this and this item and, the money and we're just interested. So hypothetical, the CEO could say, that's none of your business because that's operational and that's my space. Your governance. So stay in your lane, go over there, stay out of the kitchen. I always like to say, if you're a CEO or a CAO and you answer in that fashion, I'd suggest if you're not looking for a job in the next month, you should start looking for a job over the next 6 months, because strict policy model does not and should not stifle conversation and the sharing of information. There's a big difference between who's responsible, who has the role, and who's responsible for the decision versus communication. They're not the same thing. So I learned, as I mentioned, I worked as a CEO for 6 years. I learned really quickly that if members of my board had a question and it kept popping up, I better find a way to answer that question. And through that, I can demonstrate that myself and the team, we know what we're doing. This is why we're going down this road. This is why we've selected this path. This is why we've made this investment. If I can't do that, I'm not doing my job. But so that's a key consideration here. If you all become policy people and start to support it, this is the banner. This is the bumper sticker. It's not a weapon. It's a tool. It provides benefits. It can't be used by an administrator to smack a counselor on the head to say, you can't ask that question. And in the same way, it can't be used by counsel to force a decision on an administrator when it's their responsibility through policy. If you know what I'm saying. This is the biggest risk to the discussion of policy is people like to use it as a weapon. And it can go both ways. Very, very quickly, when I worked in that organization, there was one piece of business and it was a budget piece of decision, and it represented a significant amount of money. And my board would not leave it alone. And I wanted the third parties that were receiving that money to submit accountability reports back to us. We had to know that they were responding. Few of the board members felt that that was inappropriate and they shouldn't be doing it. My response was, well, I can't answer. We mostly had government funding. I can't answer for the value of that money unless I'm allowed to put a framework in. They wouldn't let me do it. So I would, without no disrespect, I just said to the board, okay, I have responsibility for that chunk of business as reflected in policy. You need to now take that out, and now you're responsible for it, which is what they did, right? So it works both ways. If I don't have the ultimate responsibility for it, then it should not sit within my bucket.
Hey, Roy, we have a question that came up on that topic of HR and the way in which council can provide direction. And so one of those questions is, can council give direction to the CEO to manage employees through policies or employee job descriptions? Is that the appropriate way for them to give that direction?
100%. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%. Great question. And it's hitting the sweet spot. Council, through their policy, would say, you will not hire, for example, hypothetical, you will not hire somebody. Executive limitations is what we're talking about. You can see it on the slide. You will not hire somebody without a fully comprehensive job description and a thorough, search. You will not allow the organization to operate without an extensive industry appropriate HR manual and ensuring that every employee is familiar with all aspects of that manual. So you provide the guidance as a council to reduce your risk as a council of handing that function over to the CAO. And you do that through those very prescriptive things. Do what you need to do, but don't operate without these. And another example, Dustin, would be you will not operate without an annual performance review for every single employee. So you have to do those things. And the monitoring side of it is that once or twice a year, the council says, okay, we're monitoring the HR policy, treatment of staff. Come back with us, come back with your report to show us how you're in compliance with everything we've asked you to do. So that's a great example of how that delegation happens and is defined through policy, reduces risk for council, provides really good clarity for your CAO.
Nice. So it's all kind of mediated through the building and approval of policies and various things, as opposed to just sort of one-off direction.
Yep, you're right. It's all prescribed. The policy might have whatever, 8 or 9 very specific, concise points of direction within them to guide that relationship. There's clarity. Everybody understands what the expectations are and where they're not supposed to go. And there's a big segue into this policy model. Traditionally, you've got what the Carver model would call ANS policies. We don't use that term anymore, but council or the boards are responsible for setting the strategic direction for the organization, whether it's a municipality or whether it's a nonprofit or whatever. They are responsible for saying, this is where we want to go. These are our priorities going forward. They need to be general and not too prescriptive, but this is where we want to go. So that's a responsibility of council. Not without involving administration in that, but ultimately they're responsible for formalizing that, because under the policy-based model, then the CAO or the CEO knows what they're charged with. I have to accomplish those priorities. Now I better develop the plan and operational investments to get us there. The governance process, this second circle, sort of top 2 o'clock there, council, you have your own policies that you have to check to make sure you're doing what you need to be doing as a council, right? So it's not just the CEO that you prescribe policies for. You ask yourself on a regular basis. An example of a policy would be role of the reeve, where you sit down and you prescribe what the role of the reeve is. And on a regular basis, you revisit that and say, are we following this? What's the role of a councillor? You have a policy on that. So again, it's just a policy that you review on an annual basis to make sure that you as councillors, elected officials, and the council as a whole are doing their job. And then the council delegation, this is usually a really short set of policy, but it generally describes how you're going to delegate pieces of work to your administration, 3 or 4 steps, and how you're going to assess their performance against that, right? And then executive limitations. I'm going to show an example of what that is. Executive limitation is basically do what you need to do to get the job done. Don't break any laws. Do anything you need to do, but don't do it without doing these things, as Dustin and I were just talking about in relation to HR. These executive limitations are always written in the negative. And trust me, people don't like that, but having worked under executive limitations, they're gold. They work really, really well. And they empower your team to say, we can do what we need to get done as long as we don't step outside of these lines. Now, I put here on the bottom, council delegation and executive limitations, depending on where the roles and responsibilities sit. I guess what I'm proposing is that there should be policy that describes roles and responsibilities wherever they sit, right? So it might not just be for the CAO. There could be some flexibility around that. You might not land in best practice. There could be flexibility around that. So again, sort of a couple of summary slides here. Policy mirroring practice. So this gets back to what I've been talking about throughout the day. I didn't come up with this. This was something one of my colleagues stated to me one day when we were driving down the highway, and it just resonated with me. While we want to always talk about best practice, the value of policy is to provide a common and shared view into what's happening. It doesn't matter if it's way over here, if it's in the center on that continuum, and if it's over here, as long as it's written down and there's policy that prescribes it and everybody understands what they are supposed to do, then there's value that could come from that. So policy mirroring practice, back to the HR piece. If council is going to stay involved, that doesn't mean that they don't need to have policy that prescribes what's appropriate if they play that role. Division of labor. So 3, I don't really have steps to walk through in terms of how you apply this, but here's kind of 3 maybe guiding points. Division of labor, right? Have that continued discussion with council. What's council responsible for, and what are you going to delegate? And hopefully through that ongoing discussion, you start, and familiarity and comfort with writing policy. Don't start from scratch. Beg, borrow, steal. As a consultant, I didn't write my first set of policies for my client. I took them from an association that I worked for. And all this stuff gets shared and it's out there. You don't need to start from scratch. Take the policy, vet it, make it work for you, but start that discussion about what roles are you going to assign and prescribe through policy, and start going down that road. Sort of reflecting what was discussed at the start, defining expectations and authority. Making sure the expectations are clear, and make sure if you assign the roles and responsibility, the authority comes with it. I have the capacity to make a decision because it's prescribed in the policy, right? And then the last one is keeping the feet to the fire. And this is when I talk about monitoring, like checking back in. Are you doing what we asked you to do through the policy? Come back and tell us that you are. Show us that you are. And if you aren't, you need to explain why. So monitoring. So who's going to do what? clearly define the expectations and what's going to happen with that, and then write the policy and make sure that you keep revisiting that policy and updating that policy and monitor to make sure the direction you provided is what's being followed up. I just thought I thought at the end here I'd show a couple of slides. And again, I got to stay on the HR path here. So policy 4.3, and I know you can't read these, but is treatment of staff. So this is where the board, for example, or a council would say, here's the policy on treatment of staff. You're going to be responsible for staff, but here's what you will do. And I know it, and you might be able to see it, but it says, accordingly, he, she may not operate without written personnel procedures and clarity, clear procedural rules for staff. I think my glass is on. And then there's, 3 or 4 of these. Discriminate against any staff member. Fail to establish and implement a salary and benefit agreement. All these pieces that, as long as these are followed, the risk and exposure and potential liability related to the CEO being delegated with the authority is minimized for council. And as Dustin already mentioned, that HR manual within that, which would be the responsibility of the CEO, is very, very important. And then in terms of how you apply this policy model, so you write the policy, that's great. And then the policy goes and sits on a shelf and you never look at it again. The model doesn't allow for that. Here's an example of the schedule. So you can see here, this is policy 4.3, and the report is due, in this example, it's due in August and it's due in January. So twice a year, the CEO or the CEO needs to come back to council or to the board with a report, a concise report, explaining how they're in compliance with every one of the requirements written in the policy. You ask the question. If the board or council wants more information, that's their opportunity to say, I understand you're saying you're in compliance with this, but I'd like a little bit more information just to make sure I'm comfortable with your answer. And that's where the discussion is held. It's not held when all of a sudden there's an issue that pops up and everything goes sideways because there isn't any policy to describe who's responsible for it. So it's kind of that piece. You have the governance policies for a council, for example. The standard set maybe has about 10 policies in it. Executive limitations for the CAO, for example, ranges from 10 to 15. There's the delegation, how do we delegate and what does the monitoring schedule look like? So again, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. These things are tried and true. They've been applied. They provide value, and it's just getting started is the biggest piece. Start with one chunk. Start with one piece. Start to become familiar with using this as a tool. So I think closing slide here, write it down. I started by saying that, and I'll say it again. Write it down. Write policy. It's not as difficult and as intimidating as you think it is. And to a great degree, administrators and councils likely have some policy and procedures already that exist. And it might be from in terms of policies for the team. These ones are policies that exist between the council and administration. Again, you might have some of these, but you start to standardize them and you start to put them in one working policy manual, basically, that includes them all. And that's the policy guide. So policy is the tool that supports the division of labor, if we want to talk about roles and responsibilities. And it's the tool that defines the working relationship. And while I've said the tool, of course, legislation and these other things that sit above this define it quite clearly. But within that, policy is the way to build efficiency and values around its roles and the relationships between council and the administration. Provides that shared understanding. It provides for repeatable and consistent practices in the same sense that a procedure might. Consistent practices that really drive that effective leadership and allow for good, strong decision making. It allows organizations to be nimble. I know I can make this decision. I know what the rules are. I'm within the rules. I'm making the decision. Let's go. It provides proactive and suitable time and place for conversation. So I've already mentioned that. It makes sure that time doesn't go on and unfold without you having the conversation on how the roles and responsibilities as prescribed are working. So it provides all this great value. To sum that all up, it also frees council. It should lift things from the council table to allow them to focus on the other things that they maybe feel are more important, or as important or require their time. So it should provide some efficiency at that council table and allow them to spend more time discussing current and major issues as opposed to providing their fiduciary oversight without the rules and regs. Dustin, I think I've arrived at the end, I think, of my presentation. Maybe if there's, we can wrap with any questions, thoughts, or comments.
I did see another one come in here. What are the different ways to use policy resolutions and bylaws in a correct manner?
Resolutions and bylaws, I don't know that I am the right person to speak to that. Policies are policies of council. So they can write them and they can change them at any time. And I guess they would require in the corporate world, the changes to policy would require a motion of the board, right? Mm-hmm. In the rural municipal world, how that works and how that fits, whether you need a motion or a resolution, it's not my space of expertise. So I don't think I can effectively answer the question, other than they need to be revisited on a regular basis. And the ownership of policies, and this is a very important point, the ownership of policy lies with the council. They don't have to go to the ratepayers. They don't have to go to anybody else. As long as they're compliant with the legislation, they don't have to get the permission. They can change them at any point in time. So for example, if you have a report that comes back from the CAO that's reporting back on one executive limitation, and council says, I'm not comfortable with that. I'm not comfortable with you continuing to have the authority in this space. So we're going to pull back and we're going to refine the policy to lock it down a little bit more. And I'm maybe not hitting the answer on the head here, but an example is, and this happens a lot in the corporate world, and to a degree can happen, it's basically applicable to the municipal world as well. If you get a new administrator, or if an organization gets a new CEO or a new executive director that they don't know very well, haven't had an experience working with them, haven't built an operational relationship and trust with them, they can tighten their policies down to reduce the risk. And as time unfolds, over 6 months or a year or longer working relationship between the council and the administrator or the board and the CEO, the board could be in a position to say, we've got such trust with you in this area. You no longer need to report to us on this. We're going to push that one back out. It's all yours now, because trust does have a play in it, right? Trust and repeated confidence that you develop. You can implement that into the policy. You can change them. And again, you don't have to go to the membership, but you don't have to get the ratepayers to do that. I don't know if I provided a reasonable answer on that or not.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think you helped focus on specifically how policy can be used effectively. And I think that's great for this particular segment. I'm curious, just in your experience, Roy, where did things break down? What's the most common place where the lanes get overlapped, or there starts to be conflict between council and administration, and how do you address that?
Yeah, I think, again, not having worked on a council or worked in a municipality, I would suggest some of the, I'd revert back to those, 5 things not to do, Dustin.
Yeah.
As a councillor from the seeds, I think things break down when individual elected officials, rightly or wrongly, maybe direct somebody within the team to do something.
Right.
I think that's a little bit of a breakdown that I think can happen frequently, because then all of a sudden you have 2 different people who are, or 2 or 3 different people that are directing the same individual. In the same sense, when you flip that, then you all of a sudden have a breakdown in chain of command. If the chain of command sits and rises up to the administrator, to the CAO, then you have a breakdown in command where all of a sudden the staff person is answering to a councillor as opposed to the CAO.
Yeah.
So that's one example of, I think, where things can potentially break down.
Sure.
Clarity for sure, Dustin. Clarity, when again, as this slide says, write it down. clarity and misinterpretation of verbal guidance or verbal direction. People, interpret things differently. So again, things break down when the understanding isn't written down. If I can say
That's
that.
fair. Yeah, that's fair for sure. Well, I'm not seeing any other questions come on in, but there's been lots of really good and helpful information here. And I love that you left your email and your phone number on this last slide, because you continue to do work for rural municipalities, urbans as well, and you're available as a consultant to serve councils, hey?
Yeah, you bet I am, Dustin. Yeah, our members of the,
great.
definitely, yeah, our team's there to, whether it's a conversation or whether it's assistance, either way.
Well, that's great to know that you're in the sector and doing this good work. So thank you, Roy. I appreciate you taking the time again to share this area of obvious passion for you. And of course, something that's borne fruit in a lot of different contexts. So thank you so much for joining us today, Roy.
Really appreciate the chance, Dustin. Thanks for inviting me.
That's
Thanks,
great.
everybody. Enjoy the rest of the program.
Okay, so we're on to our last segment of our session together. And so it's my pleasure to invite Niki Smith. Niki is Assistant Deputy Minister with the Saskatchewan Ombudsman. You've been there, Niki, since 2016, and you've worked in various capacities at the Ombudsman's office, including intake, investigations, and now to focus on municipal engagement and capacity building. Prior to joining the Ombudsman office, Niki held roles in both public and private sectors, focusing on community engagement and local government. If I recall, Niki, you were an RM administrator for a time.
That's
Which,
right. A short
that's
while,
great.
but a while nonetheless.
Yeah. So we're going to do something a little different here, Niki and I. We're going to treat this as more of a more casual conversation about the work of the Ombudsman. We're going to try to have a little bit of back and forth. And it's of course not without a little bit of risk, but Niki's got extensive experience with a couple of case studies that we're going to discuss, one with relation to conflict of interest and one with relation to code of ethics. Maybe before we get going down that road, though, you could tell us a little bit about the work of the Ombudsman's office.
Sure. I'm really happy to be here with this group this afternoon. So thank you, SARM, for the invitation, and to my other co-presenters. It was great hearing their pieces as well. So I think we're going to kind of leap back and build a bit on some of the stuff that Megan set out in her presentation. Dustin, I just want to do a check-in. We've been going for a couple of hours now. Do we need to take a quick 2 or 3 minute bio break for folks, or do you want to press through?
I think that's probably very human of you. Very humane. I think that would be great. We're actually a little bit ahead of schedule, so we could let's take 3 minutes. And so at 3:28, let's reconvene. That'll give folks a chance to stretch and bio break, grab a glass of water or coffee, and then you and I can pick up our conversation. So we'll see everybody in about 3 minutes.
Thanks, Dustin.
Well, Niki, I wonder if we can jump back in. Gave folks a bit of a break, but also want to make sure that we're able to finish on time. Yeah, where we left off was I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the work of the Saskatchewan Ombudsman's office.
Absolutely. So definitely something I love talking about. As Dustin mentioned, I'm coming up on my 10-year anniversary being with this office, and that timing is fitting because this is also, we just celebrated our 10th anniversary with having jurisdiction over municipalities. And so one of the cool things that we decided to lean into this year is to get out and be on the ground with municipalities and see how we can come alongside councils and administration to help build up capacity. So again, kind of going off what Roy was saying in that capacity building space. But a few key things that is always important to understand about the role of the Ombudsman. Number one is that we are independent and impartial. So Our office does not report to any particular minister or ministry. Our ombudsman, she is appointed through the Legislative Assembly. We get our funding through the Board of Internal Economy. So again, we've got folks from both sides, the opposition and the sitting government. So we don't have any political affiliation. So that helps us maintain our neutrality and our independence when we are reviewing decisions. We review administrative fairness, so we'll kind of talk about those themes through the case studies that we have. But what that means, or what we like to also ensure folks understand, is that we're not a substitute decision maker. So while we can review process, we can review decision making and make sure that there's a fair and reasonable process for folks to engage in, we're not here to impose or overturn decisions, whether that be of the provincial government or of the municipalities themselves. So our jurisdiction broadly covers all of the provincial ministries, agencies, boards, and commissions, which makes up about 230 entities. And now also with the jurisdiction over municipalities, which is another 700 plus municipalities and 10,000 councillors. So you can imagine it's a pretty broad mandate. We are kept very busy. We have 30 staff split between a Saskatoon office and a Regina office, but we all love the work that we do, and you'll see on the slide here that we'll stay up through my presentation. We've got a lot of ways for you to reach out to us, so encourage you to reach out if you have questions or if you want a presentation, and yeah, and then we can kind of get into our dialogue. We're going to talk about conflict of interest and code of ethics today, so hopefully that is engaging for you folks.
You know, one of the things that's interesting to me, Nikki, and as I've often thought of those things as very similar, conflict of interest and code of ethics. Could you spend a little bit of time maybe breaking that out for us? What's the difference between these two things?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of misconception that they are the same or that they're rooted in the same place. The important consideration is that both conflict of interest and code of ethics, they have different legislative thresholds, different requirements, and different available remedies when something has been contravened under the code of ethics or the conflict of interest. So section 93.1 and 93.2, without being too bombarded in the Municipalities Act, but those are the sections that relate to code of ethics, which is essentially setting out the standards of behavior and expectation of values that councillors will ensure that they engage in while they're sitting around the table and when they're out in the community as an elected official. The other piece is the conflict of interest. And so that's section 141 to 146 of the Municipalities Act. And it really focuses or hones in on when you have something that could be a real or a perceived conflict of interest, you might have something to gain, or somebody that you know might have something to gain just by the nature of your position, because you're around the table to make that decision. Those are areas of conflict of interest that you should be declaring. And Megan went through that process in her session, so I won't belabor it too much. But I think a few of the key components when I think about code of ethics and conflict of interest are really around the thresholds and the outcomes of contravention. So when you have a code of ethics contravention, the Act indicates that you should have a bylaw in place. Megan talked about that. There needs to be a way to raise a concern about somebody not adhering to those values or those behaviors that are expected of the elected officials. And at the end of it, some of the outcomes or remedies would include having to do some training, perhaps an apology needs to be provided to the aggrieved party, things of that nature. But when it comes to conflict of interest, there is a really prescriptive process for dealing with that. And it does include a removal of the elected official. And the threshold is really high because the impact on democracy is really high when you're removing an elected official. So those are some important things to keep in mind. We'll get into it when we do the case studies, but I'll also talk to you about the appeals process that exists for conflict of interest violations versus not so much, or maybe less formal with code of ethics.
That's great. There was as you were talking there, Nikki, there was a really good question that came in, but I want to defer that question because I think some of that's going to get clear as we have our discussion. And you talk about the case studies a little bit. So for whoever's putting the questions in, that's awesome. That's great. and definitely want to get to those. So we'll do our best to do that in a bit. So code of ethics, conflict of interest, different thresholds, different outcomes. How does the Ombudsman's office handle those? Same way, or are they're different paths?
Yeah, so we start out all of our complaints kind of in a similar fashion, gathering some initial details and going from there. But I can talk you through a little bit more detail how we would handle starting with the code of ethics. So because there's a legislative requirement for each municipality to have a bylaw in place that manages complaints of that nature, typically, and I'll use typically and generally a lot because as most of you have probably heard in an ombudsman presentation, it depends. So it's not extremely black and white. But for the most part, I can say that if somebody comes to our office with a concern about a potential code of ethics breach, we're going to first ask them if they've engaged in that complaint process locally. So are they aware of the complaint process for their municipality? Have they talked to the administrator? Have they tried to raise a formal complaint? We'll point them back to that in that direction. We'll encourage them to seek out the code of ethics bylaw. Once the person has gone through that avenue, or if they've already gone through that avenue, the next step we're going to take is asking for a copy of the decision or understanding what process took place. As I mentioned, we review administrative process. And so in the case of code of ethics, we're wanting to ensure once the person's gone through the code of ethics bylaw complaint process, were they treated fair? Was the bylaw followed appropriately? Essentially, did they have an opportunity to raise their complaint in a meaningful way? And did they receive a meaningful response in return? Those are the fairness aspects that we're going to look at under code of ethics. What we're not going to do, and this is probably the more interesting part for folks on this session today, what we're not going to do is review or investigate the alleged incident or the conduct itself. We're not here to determine if the behavior of the council member was appropriate or not appropriate. What we're here to do is to guide that process and ensure that process was followed appropriately for the person to complain, be heard, and have a review and a response back. So another question that I know we get a lot, Dustin, around this area is, can we submit our code of ethics complaints to the Ombudsman for investigation? And so I need to say, as a first off, that's not the case, because again, with not being a substitute decision maker, we also can't take over part of your process that you're meant to implement as part of the Municipalities Act. So the Municipalities Act really requires that you have a process on the ground in your community to deal with this. And so the Ombudsman's office can't circumvent that. If you've been through the process and you have concerns, that's more where we would start to engage and likely follow up with your administration to gather some more information.
Okay, that's helpful. So there's conflict of interest and code of ethics, two different things. They're treated differently by the Ombudsman's office. And maybe we could look a little bit at one of those first and go through a bit of an experience that I had. Let's start with conflict of interest. So this was a few weeks ago. I received a phone call from a ratepayer. That person wanted to know what he should do with his evidence for conflict of interest. He claims that the council hired a local electrical company for office upgrades, and the company chosen is owned by one of the councillors. So is that a conflict of interest?
That is an awesome question, and I will say one that we actually get a lot through our intake avenue. Folks' concerns that a conflict of interest has arisen. So as I mentioned, our slogan, "It depends," applies in this case. So as Megan had also mentioned, having a conflict in and of itself is not a bad thing or a wrong thing. Conflicts are bound to happen, but it's what you do with that conflict or with that information as it arises. So the first thing that we would probably look to ask in our office are questions around whether or not the individual declared, how the person calling is aware that there's a conflict of interest, things like that. In the situation where you have a council member owning the electrical company, and then that electrical company is being hired, I went through a similar situation when I was an ARM administrator. And there was only one local company. So we really had a hard time getting away from it unless we were going to hire somebody from an hour or 2 hours away from the closest large community. And so it's okay that the municipality decided to hire this councillor member's company, so long as the council member declared the conflict, didn't engage in any of the conversation around hiring, around rates, or around payment of accounts. And so that's the other piece that I think is really important. If you do have the council member's company doing work for your municipality, you're going to want to make sure that they're not approving any of the accounts for payment to go back to their company. Again, that real and that perceived interest in seeing a bill paid when they're the one submitting the invoice. I also want to make a little distinction here because we did talk, or some of the previous presenters talked about council members not doing work or not being employees of the municipality. So in this instance, Dustin, the way that you described it, they're not hiring the council member to be an employee of the municipality. So they're not out there doing the grading of the roads or snow removal or mowing. They really are there in the capacity as a professional to do a professional specific piece of work. So in this case, the electrical work that you'd have to hire a professional for, you wouldn't typically have an electrician on staff for your municipality.
Sure.
I don't know if that clears things up on that side of
Well,
it.
so it's very likely that this is a conflict of interest. And so now what should the ratepayer do with this information? Like how do they pursue this matter?
For sure. So I think part of it I alluded to, the first thing that we would encourage them to do is reach out to the administrator, find out if the member in question had declared a conflict of interest at the last meeting or the meeting that this was decided at. Getting copies of the minutes should show really clearly if the conflict was declared or not declared, if it was referenced at all. All of that conversation should be apparent through the minutes. So if the individual goes, gets the minutes, talks to the administrator, finds out, oh yeah, this person was not part of the decision at all, then that's a pretty open and shut case for a conflict of interest. If they find through gathering that information that perhaps the individual did participate, then some more digging is going to have to happen. So if they still have concerns after talking with the administrator and getting a copy of the minutes or a copy of the public disclosure statement, those kinds of things, if there's still questions and concerns, we would encourage that individual, that ratepayer, to submit a formal complaint to council. It would then be up to council to review that complaint and decide whether or not they feel the individual is in a conflict, or if the person themselves believes they are in a conflict, to kind of assign responsibility or to determine that there was no responsibility to assign. From there, it's our expectation from the Ombudsman's office that anytime somebody submits a complaint to council, whether it be a conflict of interest, a complaint about the road, or a code of ethics complaint, the council is engaging in providing reasonable responses. By reasonable response, we mean timely, that meaningful reasons are provided about how and why the decision was made, and any indication of an appeal process. So in the case of conflict of interest, if council reviewed the situation and they felt, no, you know what, this individual did everything they were supposed to do, they met the requirements of the act, so they're not in a conflict of interest, then they could send a letter to, or have the administrator send a letter to the individual who raised the complaint. It would set out why they disagree with the assumption of the ratepayer, and possibly a copy of the resolution that explains, you know what, we're satisfied that this individual took the steps needed. We don't find they're in a conflict of interest. But it should also include the appeal mechanisms. So again, as was mentioned previously, being overly open, it's counterintuitive sometimes, but it actually will, in more likelihood, de-escalate a situation or take the wind out of the sails of somebody who's trying to escalate. And so in the case of appeals for conflict of interest, letting the person know that if they disagree with the decision of council, they have an ability to apply to the courts for a judge to make that determination. Like and oftentimes we hear, well, it doesn't matter what I submit as a complaint, they're not going to listen to me, they're just going to say it was all good, they're going to cover for each other. whether right or wrong, that's the message that we often hear. And so what we do let folks know is that if they disagree with the substantive outcome that the person was or was not in a conflict of interest, they do also have a remedy through the courts that they can access.
Right. So that was from the perspective of the ratepayer, what they should do with their evidence for a conflict of interest. What should the council do on their side? Let's say they receive this complaint. What's their role then?
Yeah, so again, making sure that they fully review the situation, make sure they fully review the complaint. So don't be dismissive. Do the due diligence of going back through the minutes, having the conversation with the people around the table, trying to get to the bottom of it to determine if a conflict did exist or why somebody feels like there's a potential conflict there. It's really important to have those open conversations around your table. Again, as was mentioned in, I think, both the previous presentations, you want to make sure that you really understand the policies and the rules that you're meant to adhere to. So, going back through your disclosure statement, making sure that you have crossed all your T's and dotted all of your I's that way, that you've taken any training. Sometimes even letting the ratepayer know what training you've undertaken can be helpful in them having more trust in your organization. So if your council regularly goes through training or has taken a course on conflict of interest, they've had the Ombudsman come out and talk about it. Those are really good things to include in your response to the ratepayer, especially if you're going to be, shutting down their allegation. Sorry, go ahead,
carry
Dustin.
on. No, you go ahead. I was going to move us on to a different question, but if there's more there, let's keep going with that.
Yeah, I think the other piece that I would want to suggest with council is that if they feel that something was missed or overlooked or that a conflict did arise, there is an onus on you as the rest of broader council to really address that and be that voice for the rest of the people in the community. You're at the table. And so there is a higher expectation that you really manage those concerns from the public because you have the voice at the table. So again, even if it's before a decision happens, while I understand the legislation does not allow you to declare for the person next to you a conflict of interest, if you have concerns, you should be raising them. There's ways to do that in a reasonable and polite way around the table to not create more angst. But if you're really worried that somebody's about to trip into a conflict of interest, there is some responsibility for you as a member of council to raise that and engage in that conversation ahead of time.
Got it. I wonder if this would be a good time, given the question that came in on our chat, to address that. So this is, what is the role of council when a complaint of conflict of interest is brought against one of the council members when that council member resigned after the complaint was brought forth?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
so if I'm getting it right, essentially somebody was potentially in a conflict of interest, a ratepayer raised the concern, that person left their position and now they don't know how to handle the original.
What do we do with that? Yeah, so that's how I'm reading it too, Nikki.
That's a really good question, a deep question. On the face of it, I would say that it would be imperative to review the decision that the individual was involved in. So if it was a decision that was close, like a close vote, like say it was a 3-4 split and that person was the deciding vote, you may want to reconsider reviewing that resolution or that motion and maybe coming back to it with your new quorum and addressing it at that point, particularly if it's something that can be walked back. Hopefully it's something that can be walked back if it was a really close vote. You'd know through your bylaws and your procedure bylaw specifically how you can rescind a resolution. So that might be a consideration. If it's something that was going to pass anyway, it still may warrant bringing the resolution back to clarify this was passed by a majority and would have been regardless of this person's involvement. Again, just to keep your minutes updated and maintain that public trust so that people don't think that something got swept under the rug just because the individual is no longer around the table. So those are some approaches I'd consider. But if the person who asked the question, if they have like a specific situation going on, I'm more than happy if you reach out to me or you can reach out to our intake team and they can walk you through some additional resources on that too.
That's helpful, Nikki. Thank you. So that was conflict of interest. I think I've got my head around that a little bit. Let's talk about code of ethics a little bit further. Um, are there, are there instances where you've had to assess a code of ethics allegation? And what did you do with it? Like, how did it work?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting piece of work and probably where we're really going to get into the meat and potatoes of ombudsman work in this space. So we've received a boatload of code of ethics complaints to our office. Particularly in the last year, we've seen a pretty significant uptick in complaints specifically about code of ethics processes. So the answer is yes, our office does review them. We receive a lot of complaints about them. How engaged we get, again, depends on the work that the individual's done before coming to us. But we have received complaints from the individual who was alleged to have contravened the code of ethics. We've received complaints from other council members around the table concerned with one individual. We received complaints from the public about members of council. And we've also received complaints from administration about members of council. So it really can kind of come from a lot of different directions. Our advice or our guidance to each person is going to depend on their own situation. But to kind of go back to the touch point I gave at the beginning of this session, it's not going to be for our office to say that the behavior itself was right or was wrong. So any review that our office is going to do is really going to be focused on the process. So I want to be really clear there. Our office is not a way to kind of nail somebody or point the finger at them. And in the same breath, it's not a way to have vindication from the situation where you've been told that you have contravened the code of ethics bylaw. So again, we're not getting into the behavior or the conduct, we're reviewing the process. So that's a bit of a misnomer there. I wanted to talk about a specific example. Some of you folks might be familiar with this one. It did appear in a recent annual report, but we can get into the nuts and bolts of how our office processed it. There was a mayor who filed a complaint against a councillor alleging a violation of code of ethics in a couple of different areas. Respect and leadership and public interest were some of those areas. In this case, they actually hired a consultant to engage in the investigation process. After that was all done, the report was received and council had made their decision on outcomes. The councillor who had the contravention imposed on them or that was seen to have violated the code of ethics bylaw came to our office concerned that he was not treated fairly through the investigation process. So in this case, he had done what he needed to do by raising his concerns with council. He participated in the process of the investigation. And so there were outcomes that we could look at and we could look back at the entire process. So that's what we did. He had two areas of concern about his fair treatment. The first area, I'm just laying some groundwork and then we can get into the questions, but the first area of concern is that he was only ever told about the allegations verbally. So in the initial meeting where the complaint came forward from the mayor, the complaint was read out and that was the only information or context he was provided. He asked on multiple occasions to have a written copy provided to him of the allegations, and this was refused. Further to that, once the complaint was received, council made the decision to remove this individual from some of the committees that he was on and also required him to attend regular council meetings via Zoom so that it wouldn't become an encumbrance on the meeting itself by having him in the room while things continued to escalate and the situation was being investigated. So in this case, after some initial information gathering from the individual and from the administration, from the municipality, we did decide that there were a few things going on that we were just a little bit unsure of. So that doesn't mean that we're, when we go to investigate, it doesn't mean that we're saying something bad has happened or that we've come to any conclusion. We're just saying that, you know, upon further review, we still have some outstanding questions that we need to get to the bottom of. So that's when we issue what we call a notice to investigate or a notice of investigation. And in doing so, we have to frame out the areas that we're going to look at. So in this case, we set out three what we call fairness questions that we were going to review with the municipality. So I think it's sometimes helpful to understand how we frame those questions and go from there. So I am going to just go to my paper and read out what the questions specifically were. So our investigation focused on number one, did the council have authority to remove the councillor from his committee positions and require him to attend regular council meetings via Zoom prior to the Code of Ethics investigation being complete? Number two, we asked, did council use an administratively fair process to review and respond to the Code of Ethics complaint? And number three, were the remedial actions imposed by council reflective of the nature and severity of the Code of Ethics violation? And did they employ an approach of progressive measures? So again, that's something that we want to be mindful of anytime we're imposing any kind of restriction on an individual, particularly an elected person. Do you have the authority to impose that restriction? And is it reasonable given the situation itself?
Right. So there's two things that stand out to me about your approach there. The first that was a bit surprising is you're not investigating the consultant, actually. They're kind of off the table. And then the second thing is you're not asking the question about did this person actually do what they were accused of doing? So how does that work? How come those aren't considered?
Absolutely. So I'm going to start with the second question first. I think I've addressed it in a few different ways here, but really the reason we're not asking about the incident itself in the fairness question is because, again, we're not here to determine whether the individual contravened, whether or not the behavior was right or wrong. We're here to see, okay, he's gone through the process and he said he didn't get a fair shake in the review and the investigation. That's where we're going to focus our efforts and our resources. It's a really good point about the consultant and why we address it to council versus the consultant, Dustin, and especially with more and more municipalities reaching out to these services, these third-party investigators. It's important to know that and any of you who've seen me present before will know this is kind of my staple statement, but council has the ability to delegate the task, but not the authority. And so you can hire somebody to do the process for you, but at the end of the day, the responsibility sits at the feet of council as to whether or not they accept the report, to ensure the consultant followed your bylaw, to make sure that any remedial action that's imposed is in line with what you're allowed to do through the Municipalities Act. And I'll caveat this of Saskatchewan, because we've also seen situations where a different jurisdiction's legislation has been applied here in Saskatchewan. So being mindful of all of those pieces. The Ombudsman's office doesn't have direct jurisdiction over consultants. We have jurisdiction over the municipality and the work that the municipality does or farms out, for a lack of a better term. So we can review that work because it is an obligation of the municipality to do that work. But again, we're not looking at investigating the consultant themselves, and they kind of get to keep themselves out of it because you still as council have to make that resolution. You have to agree with the report. You have to decide, does this report stand up to the facts and evidence that were presented and things of that nature? So that's the distinction there. Okay.
So you're investigating, you asked the questions that you had mentioned earlier, those three. What if council doesn't want to participate and they don't want to give you information, they don't want to provide you with the documentation, none of that stuff? What happens then?
So this is really interesting. It's a very unique component of the Ombudsman's Act. So while any of our documents that we collect, any of our records are not FOIPable, meaning that we're not beholden to the Privacy Act in the same way that other institutions are, we have no obligation to give our documents out. We can require documents be provided to us. So while we try for as best as possible to do that through moral suasion and through good governance, we would ask and request that documentation. Ultimately, if a municipality or a ministry absolutely refused to participate in the process or absolutely refused to give us copies of documents that we're seeking through an investigation, our ombudsman has the power to subpoena those records or subpoena an interview. So we've never to my knowledge, the Ombudsman's Office of Saskatchewan has never used that authority, but we do have that authority. So important to be mindful of. But again, we're always trying to find how can we work on this collaboratively. It's never our goal. It's never the goal of the Ombudsman's Office to point to a municipality and blame or shame. We really are always focused on bettering the practices and making things better for the greater good. So not just the people around the table, around the council table, but for the people in your community as well. So that's a little piece on that.
Yeah, for sure. So, yeah, that makes sense. I'm glad you haven't had to use that authority, and that mostly folks understand that they want to participate and cooperate in appropriate ways. So you're trying to do some interviews, let's say. How do you pick who you're going to interview among the council? Do you interview everybody or just select people?
Yeah, so municipalities are a bit interesting when we go out to do investigations, because typically we will interview everyone around the table, because you're all equal parts making those decisions together as a collective, versus say maybe when we're in a ministry, we might interview the frontline staff and their supervisor. In the case of a municipality, we almost always interview every council member and administration staff. Any other staff that might have been witness or individuals who might have witnessed the situation, we may interview them. But again, it's going to depend on the situation. So in this case, it wasn't a question of the council members' behavior. So we didn't really need to interview anybody who witnessed the behavior. We really were focused on interviewing the staff involved in the complaint process and staff that were familiar with implementing the bylaw, as well as the members around council who were involved in the decision making. We did also gather information and documentation, including bylaws, emails, a copy of the Code of Ethics form. We collected exchanges with the consultant. So even though we weren't investigating the consultant proper, we did want to see what the correspondence between the municipality and the consultant was. We gathered copies of the consultant's reports. In this case, there were a couple of reports. So that's a bit about what we collect. Also, minutes are another big one that we often collect.
Okay. What sort of questions would you ask folks? What kind of interview questions do you deal with?
Yeah, so in the case of Code of Ethics complaints, we will ask questions around the nature of the complaint and going back to the incident, just to get everybody's recollection or perception of what transpired that day and how we ended up at the complaint process. We're also going to ask questions around how familiar each individual is with the local bylaws. Have you read your Code of Ethics bylaw? Do you know what's expected? Did you review the Code of Ethics bylaw after receiving the complaint? Do you know what's allowed under the Act? Those are the types of questions that we're going to ask of each of the council members. We're also going to talk about timelines. We're going to want to know about context. I'm jumping ahead a little bit in this case, but in this instance, we heard from all of the other members around the table that the situation that was addressed in this particular complaint against this council member was something that had been ongoing for quite some time. And so, in fact, council had been trying in different ways to mitigate the behavior through collective training, through communication guidelines and policies and different things like that. So again, it shows that this is something that they've tried to address in different ways, and they didn't just kind of jump straight to the Code of Ethics complaint form.
Right. So I'm so curious, how did this wind up? How did it play out?
Yeah, so we did find, after doing all of our reviews and investigation, we did credit the municipality with trying to work through the process in good faith to the best of their ability. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know, right? And so this was their first time having to use the Code of Ethics bylaw and process. So they relied heavily on advice and guidance from their consultant and put a lot of faith in the experience and expertise of the consultant. So we did find that it was great that they went external, especially because you have one council member submitting complaint against another council member about something that had transpired around the council table. So you kind of all have a bit of skin in the game. So we thought it was really good that they went external to quash any notion of bias or perceived bias. However, it was on the advice of the consultant that they not provide a written copy of the complaint to the individual. And so a cornerstone of procedural fairness is that you have the right to know the case that's being brought against you, and you have a right to express or be heard, have your side of things heard. And so the individual's concern that he didn't have an ability to properly participate or advocate for himself without knowing the specifics of the allegation and to his definition, understand them because he had them in writing and could go through them, he didn't have a fair process. So we did agree that that component was missed in the process. And so that's where we had a conversation and some training, some coaching work with the municipality to say, hey, this is really why it's important that you understand your obligations under the bylaw. Your bylaw says that you should be doing this. So therefore you should, and also procedural fairness would guide that you would have done that. That being said, we also heard, as I mentioned, that this was progressive, that the council had been trying to come at the situation from different avenues and implement different tools to try and address what was going on. So we didn't think that the fact that, I guess we called it like a scale or threshold question, because at the end of the day, we saw where they went with the entire investigation, why the rationale was for the outcome. The remedial action was in line with what their bylaw allowed and was reasonable given the context of the complaint and how it had transpired. But we thought that there was room for improvement. So, in the end of this one, we made recommendations to council to basically establish a more clear bylaw. The other thing, their bylaw didn't expressly direct how a third party would be engaged. So we suggested that they include that, make a more robust bylaw, and that they consider applying the remedial action to everyone on council. So by remedial action, we mean the training. So in talking with the administrator, because we've constantly got lines of communication open during an investigation. We've been talking with the administrator who already indicated council was wanting to update their bylaw and wanting our help with that. And they also talked about wanting to seek additional training for everyone, not just the individual. So although their report and their code of ethics findings suggested that this individual need to do training specific to ethics and workplace safety and respect in the workplace, they were committed and willing to all take that on. So in the end, our recommendations were kind of implemented as we went along, but that was the outcome there. We found that there was room for improvement, definitely, but that they were on the right track. So again, not that blaming and shaming, but finding opportunities to better the situation for the next time around.
So it's pretty nice that they were open to your input and took the recommendations really well. If they weren't, what happens then? What happens if a council's like, yep, thanks, but no thanks? Where does the Ombudsman's office go?
Yeah, we always hope that that isn't how we end an investigation. So I'll just take a quick step back and say the only time our office can make formal recommendations is through a formal investigation. And so at the end of that or through that process, we're generally having that dialogue with the administrator or with council talking about, room for improvement, what our expectations are going to be at the outcome, so that we're coming up with these recommendations, not in a silo here at the Ombudsman's office and not making it something that can't be easily or reasonably implemented on the ground. We're not seeking make work projects for your municipality. I want to make that really clear. We get that your resources are already stretched thin. So the recommendation should never come as a surprise. That said, there might be situations where the municipality simply disagrees with our recommendations or doesn't want to implement or feels it might be too time or cost intrusive to implement the recommendation. We do not have the authority to impose those recommendations, so we can't make council implement them. But municipalities are a curious thing because of the way that the Act is written. So in any case where any ministry or municipality decides to reject the recommendations of the Ombudsman, our Act allows our Ombudsman to go out and provide a report to table in the House. She can submit a report to that minister in question. For municipalities, she has the ability to provide a report to the Minister of Government Relations for review. And then in the case of municipalities, what makes them so interesting is that you have a caveat in your act that essentially says any report by the Minister of Government Relations that they wish to impose on the municipality must be implemented. So if it's the whim of the Minister of Government Relations to take our report and say, you know what, yeah, we really do agree that you need to be implementing these recommendations, the minister has the power to impose them. So that's unlike other ministries and agencies and other pieces of legislation. And so I don't say that to be a threat or a hammer or anything like that. I say it in full transparency. Again, it's not something that has been used to my knowledge in the 10 years that we've had jurisdiction, but it is an avenue that the Ombudsman can take. Okay. But mostly we try to use public reports and summaries and case assessments that we post on our website to provide learning opportunities for everyone across the board rather than point fingers and say this municipality did wrong.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. Yeah. Any last takeaways for our audience here around code of ethics? I'm watching our time wind down, and I want to make sure there's room for some open questions. Were there any takeaways you wanted to make sure we got to hear?
Yeah, so I think most of what I had jotted down for the key takeaways, Megan hit home pretty hard on already.
Sure.
So yeah, I mean, you are required to have a code of ethics bylaw. Make sure you have one. Reach out to the resources on our website. We often point people in the direction of government relations resources. They have a really great tab on Saskatchewan.ca. When you're looking at taking on other templates or other people's bylaws to start to draw off of, it's a great starting point, but remember that you need to have bylaws in place in your municipality that match the needs and resources of your municipality. So again, for instance, if you're going to be hiring or you intend on hiring an external party, make sure that your bylaw is set up to do that and what that looks like. Set clear timelines in your code of ethics policy, and make sure you account for a plan B. Oftentimes, what we've seen is that more often than not, the code of ethics bylaw requires a process to go through the administrator, and that's great. If that's your point person, there's no problem with that. But what's your plan B if the administrator is the one with a complaint to submit? Who do they go through to avoid a conflict themselves? So just some little things to be mindful of. When in doubt, you are welcome to call our office. I know in the past we've had messaging that more resembled, we can't give advice and, kind of call municipal advisory services. And I know Megan's team has been great there. But I'm also here to do a little plug for our office in how we've transitioned our work. So you've seen on the slide throughout my conversation with Dustin, some options and some tools and resources. If you're a council member or you're an administrator and you want to reach out, again, we can't provide specific advice like, yes, do this, don't do that, no, don't do that, or yes, this person's in a conflict, no, they're not. We can't provide that kind of advice, but we can give you some really good tools. We can point you to resources. We can talk you through a situation and soundboard with you what we know works and what we've seen that doesn't work. We're happy to help build that capacity for you as well. So please do reach out if you have any questions that way.
Okay. All right. Well, that's great. And it's great to know that things are changing even at the Ombudsman's office and are open to some collaborative work to solve some of these things in advance. I'll pause there, looking for any questions that folks have. You have a representative from the Ombudsman's office here. You can ask any question you want. She may not answer it, but she will. You can ask whatever you want.
I will do my best.
Yeah.
As people are kind of thinking of questions, or if they have questions, I will say our work in this space, in the municipal space, really has shifted and taken off in the last 6 months. So just a little interesting tidbit, over the last 6 months, I've been out on the road and I've done more than 30 presentations to municipal councils through SARM. So thank you, SARM, for inviting us back time and again to your sessions, to the Mayor's School with SUMA. We've also presented to the Municipal Peer Network. So we're getting out there and trying to do customized training for you folks in whatever area is most impactful to you or high priority to you. So if you are interested in any of that, again, contact details on the slide there in front of you, and we'd be more than happy to come out and chat with you and your council.
Great. Well, in the absence of any questions, I'll take the time to thank you, Niki. Really great to talk to you. I've appreciated your both your knowledge and expertise, but especially your approach. I like that you're working so collaboratively with councils and SARM's members. That's just a wonderful thing, and it's a great way to, I think, a great way to chart a course to the future where folks are invited and are helped to do the right thing, as opposed to just punished for doing the wrong thing. So it's a much appreciated approach.
Yeah, thank you. And
You're
I think
welcome.
that proactive piece is the biggest piece that we're definitely trying to get ahead of. So
Wonderful. Okay. I'm going to invite Christina Berry to put her contact information into the chat. That way folks can see it if they have any questions following up, or any other information about registration. If there's maybe folks that didn't get to register but still managed to get on the call. And I think it's there now. And so with that, I think that concludes our time together. I wanted to thank the folks that took time this afternoon to be part of this Municipal Leaders Roles and Responsibilities. The recording will be available on the SARM website in due course. And of course, if there were questions you didn't feel like you could ask on the chat, you're welcome to reach out to myself or to Adam or to Christina, and we'll make sure that we get someone to respond to you. So with that, I'll bid you a good night. And again, I express my gratitude for taking the time today. Thanks, everyone.